Recently, I've been tired of building out basic React pages, so I thought to myself, let's change it up and build something actually cool. In this video, I'm going to show you step by step how to build the most fire tier list maker that anyone's ever made in React. It'll be a fully functioning drag and drop interface where we can rearrange items inside their own rows with smooth animations, move items between containers, also with buttery smooth animations, drop items in empty rows, and basically everything you could possibly want with a tier list maker. I'll walk through every single step one at a time, giving you my exact thought process and reasoning every second. All the source code will be available on GitHub, which I'll put a link to in the description. Let's get it. The primary library that we'll be using for this is Dnd-kit. It's React's most popular drag and drop library, and it's got a bunch of super cool tools to allow us to build out this tier list maker. I'll explain Dnd-kit concepts as I go, but if you want to go to the docs, I'll also link that in the description. Without further ado, let's get into the code. To create the project, we'll just use the command npm create feat at latest, as usual, which will install us a fresh React app. We'll call it tier list maker. Do the same thing for the package name. We will select React, of course, TypeScript, no roll down Vite. We're going to go ahead and install and start our server. Normally, I get rid of most of the preset CSS that Vite gives us, which I've already gone ahead and done. In order to create this tier list maker, we'll need a couple of key libraries. We'll install some more as we go, but let's get the biggest ones out of the way right now. The first one is Dnd-kit, which I just mentioned a second ago. Dnd-kit is the library that will allow us to pick up elements, drop them in different spots, sort them around, and all sorts of other functionality that will be crucial for this tier list. It's essentially the core of this project. To install it, we can take this command right here that they give us. We can go into our terminal, make a new one so we don't kill our Vite server, paste it in, and this will install Dnd-kit core into our app. In addition to the core, we'll need one more thing from Dnd-kit. If we go onto npm and we search Dnd-kit here, there is one more package that will pop up, and that's this Dnd-kit sortable. Because we're going to have functionality to move items around and sort them in different spots, we'll also need this library, which is basically just an extension of the Dnd core. So we will also take this npm install command right here, copy it, paste it into our terminal, and we'll get this added to our app as well. With these, we now have everything we need from Dnd-kit. I'll go way into more detail about how Dnd-kit works once we start actually implementing it in the code. Next, you know I love Tailwind, so we'll get that installed for all of our styling. With Tailwind v4, setup has become super quick. All we need to do is take this npm install command right here, go ahead and copy it, paste it in, and add Tailwind to our app. And then what we can do is we can go into our vconfig file, and we just have to add Tailwind here as a plugin, imported straight from Tailwind CSS Vite. And lastly, we just need to take this import Tailwind CSS, copy it, go to our main CSS file, which is this index.css, put it at the very top, save it, and now Tailwind should be good to go. Just to be sure, we'll go ahead and restart our dev server so it spins back up. And now with Dnd-kit and Tailwind out of the way, let's get started. Creating a tier list maker from scratch is a pretty big undertaking, so let's take a second, break this down, and figure out how we should start. We know that any given tier list is made up of multiple rows, one for each tier. To make this process as simple as possible, let's for right now ignore the fact that there are multiple rows. Let's get a single row with some Draggables working. And before we get started on the code, let me break down how D&D works from a visual perspective. From a very basic standpoint, we have two core concepts in Dnd-kit, Draggables and Droppables. For the sake of this video, I'm going to be calling Droppables drop zones. From a visual perspective, you can think of it like this. We have a drop zone, which I'll denote with this dash line right here, super rough kind of square like this. And then we can have any number of Draggables, we'll say 3, which I'll denote with these solid lines. So that's a terrible square. Let's draw a Draggable here, and then, I don't know, a Draggable right here. These Draggables over here on the left-hand side are the items that can actually be dropped inside the drop zone, which is right here on the right-hand side. So I could pick up with my mouse any one of these Draggables and move it over into the drop zone. So I can move this one, I could take this one, move it over, and the same exists for any other Draggable. Draggables are the items that you actually pick up, and a drop zone is the item that you actually drop it in. It's up to us to handle the React state side of this, but Dnd-kit contains the functionality to actually take these Draggables with your mouse, pick them up, and drop them inside any given drop zone. This is what the core of Dnd-kit is. Droppables, which I again am calling drop zones, that are just fixed in place, can hold Draggables. The Draggables themselves, which can be picked up with your mouse, can be dragged into the drop zones. In the context of our tier list, our drop zones are going to be the rows of our tier list. So we'll have a tier list like some big box here, where we have it split out into rows. So we have maybe S tier right here, A tier right here, B tier, C tier, you get the picture. Each of these rows is going to be a droppable zone. So these are all drop zones. And then Our draggables are going to be the individual items that can be dragged into any given row. So again, this just reinforces the core concept of draggables that can be picked up. That's these things down here. And then we can drop them into drop zones, which are static and don't move, but can hold draggables. With that basic understanding, let's go ahead and get started with the code. The first step here will be creating some draggable components so I can show you the core functionality of Dnd-kit. I went ahead and added a couple of basic images to our assets folder that will help us get started with making some easy draggables. Big shout out Clash Royale because I'll be using their images for this tier list. And all I've done is taken these images here and I've made this array called images that just maps to the source of each one. So we have Golem card, Mega Knight, Baby Dragon card, you get the idea. Just so we can have this images array be stateful and actually represent some meaningful draggables, let's go ahead and put this into state here. So right here, let's just say const draggables. Set draggables, we're going to call useState, and it's going to set itself to this images array. Now this images array here is stored in our React state draggables. We don't really care about all this preset garbage, so let's go ahead and wipe it out here. Let's start off super simple. For each one of these images in the array, so for each one of our draggables, I want to render an actual draggable component from Dnd-kit. So how do I do that? Well, let's first make a div to hold all the draggables here in app. So this outer fragment here, I'm going to turn into a div. And using Tailwind, I'm going to give it a class name. We're just going to say width screen, height screen, so it takes up the whole viewport. And to center it on the page, we'll say flex justify center and also item center. And we'll go ahead and make an actual div to hold the draggables themselves, which we'll put right here. We will just give this a class name of flex gap2, just like this. And in here, we'll just map over each of our draggables. We'll say draggables.map. And then for each draggable, we want to render out a draggable component, just like this, where the key is the draggable, and the source also happens to be just the draggable, since they are just strings. So for every single image we have in this array right here, this draggables array, we're just going to render this draggable component. Now here's where it's up to us to construct our draggables. First off, this draggable is not a built-in component in Dnd-kit. Draggable is going to be a custom component, and I'll show you exactly how we register it as an actual draggable in DND. We'll go ahead and just to clean this up, make this export defaults here. And then right below all this, we're going to make a new component called draggable. Say function draggable, just like this. And now begs the question, how do I make this custom draggable component right here actually be functionally draggable using Dnd-kit? All we have to do is inside whichever component we want to be a draggable, we need to call the useDraggable hook, just like this from Dnd-kit. UseDraggable is a hook directly from Dnd-kit, and it assumes that any component that calls this hook right here is going to be a valid draggable item. There's one thing we need to pass into UseDraggable to ensure it works properly. We need to give it an object in the arguments here, and it needs to have an ID property. Reason being, in order for Dnd-kit to keep track of every draggable, it needs a unique ID attached to every single one. Otherwise, it's not going to work the way that we want it to. This ID can be anything that uniquely identifies the draggable itself. In our case, we could just use the image source as the ID because these are all unique. However, just to not cause any confusion, let's actually add an ID property to these that'll only be used for the ID, so we don't pollute logic. To make this easier, I went ahead and made each image an object, which is an ID property, and the source string. That way we can easily differentiate between the ID and the actual string of the image. Since these are no longer just source strings, let's actually rename this variable right here to default draggables, because this is what the draggables will start as, and then we still have our draggable state. We'll also make a quick helper type real quick. Up here, we'll just say type draggable, and the type of draggable is going to be ID, which I believe it should just be a string. Yep, and then for the source, that will also just be a string. Now in here, we can say this will always adhere to type draggable, and then our useState, just to be sure that we're being explicit here, is also going to be an array of draggables. Now that we have this, whenever we're mapping over our draggables, we can say that the key right here is just draggable.id, and then we will actually pass the entire draggable down as props. So on our draggable component, now we can say we expect it to take in an entire draggable, and this draggable is going to be of type draggable, hence why we made the type up here to help. And now, because we know draggable is of type draggable, which has an ID and a source, we can get the ID out of there. So we can say const ID, and we'll go ahead and get source out. Since we know we'll use it, we'll destructure that from draggable, and that can be passed in as our actual ID to use draggable. Now that we have this, let's set up our JSX super quickly to get something to actually display on this page over here. In our return, all we're going to do for right now is just render out a simple button. Semantically, this is correct because if an element is clickable or draggable, it is a button because it accepts click or mouse down events. Just to be explicit, we'll give this a class name of a cursor pointer, so it always indicates that it is clickable. And then to actually render each draggable as an image, inside of the button, we're just going to render an image, just like this. And for the source, we will of course just plug in the image source that we have right here. The images are stored in my assets folder. So the way we can get that is we can say curly braces, template quotes, we can do source / assets / source, just like this. And this will ensure that we actually render an image. Now, if I go ahead and save it, you can see we get this nice row of our draggables. All these different Clash Royale cards here. These images here are going to be our draggable elements. You can see when you hover over them, my cursor turns to a pointer. Just to enforce that all these images are the same height and size and they don't look different like they do now, let's go ahead and throw a class name on this image. We'll say class name equals, and we'll just throw max h30, and then we'll do aspect, and I'm going to code it to 0.833 because I checked ahead of time and this is roughly the aspect ratio that all the cards are. And then we're going to go ahead and just throw object cover on it so it covers the whole image. Now, if we save it, these cards should all look uniformly sized. The question is, now what? If I hover over one of these draggables and I press and hold my mouse down and then I try to move it, nothing actually gets picked up. You probably can't see it. On my screen, I can see the image kind of moving around, but that's not the actual draggable. That's just the browser trying to move an image. So right now, Dnd-kit is doing literally nothing. And that's because there's a couple of things that we're missing in order to set these up as proper draggables. The first main thing is that this useDraggable hook that we're calling right here returns something, but we're not actually getting any return value from it. We're simply just calling it. One thing that is non-negotiable that we need from this hook is a function called setNodeRef. To get it out of useDraggable, we can simply destructure it. We can say const setNodeRef, just like this, equals useDraggable. How we use setNodeRef is we go to whichever element we want our draggable to be registered under, which is usually the outermost element in your actual component. For us, that's this button right here. All we have to do to register it is say ref equals setNodeRef, and it's really that easy. Now, Dnd-kit knows that this button element is the element that we're going to attach all of our draggable functionality to. It's also important that we pull two more things out of here in addition to setNodeRef. That's listeners and attributes. So we'll get listeners and attributes just like this. Listeners and attributes are exactly what they sound like. They're listeners and attributes that need to be attached to our draggable element to ensure proper Dnd-kit handling. I don't think it'll completely break if you don't add them, but Dnd-kit does recommend adding these. For both of these, all we have to do is spread them in to the same element that our setNodeRef is on. So we can say ... listeners to spread this in. We'll also do the exact same thing for attributes. Go ahead and save this, and that will give us some formatting. Now that we have setNodeRef, listeners, and attributes, our draggable component has everything it needs to be registered as a proper draggable in the context of drag and drop. There's two more small things we need to get this to work. First, and arguably the most important piece of this entire thing, is we need to wrap all of this in a D&D context. D&D context is a wrapper component directly from Dnd-kit. Anytime you want any drag and dropping functionality, your items, like we have up here, our draggables, need to be wrapped in a D&D context. Dnd-kit literally does not work or register anything correctly without this component. So what we can do is we can highlight this entire div that's rendering all of our draggables. We can Control-Shift-P, we can wrap, and we're going to wrap it in D&D context just like this. And this D&D context will be imported from Dnd-kit core. If we go ahead and save this, and we now go over to our page, and I try to pick something up, I'm not getting that weird little image dragging anymore, but still nothing is happening, right? None of these draggables are actually moving anywhere. And that's because we're missing one final thing. Our drag and drop functionality is actually working perfectly, but we don't see anything. And that's because we're missing the CSS to actually show and animate the dragging. All we have to do to fix that is this. We need to pull transform also out of the useDraggable hook. And then up here, I'm just going to paste this in. This style right here comes directly from Dnd-kit. And basically all it's doing is that every second that we're dragging, it's actually translating the image to appear to be dragging. So it gives us the proper visual. The transform that we pull out of useDraggable has an X and a Y property, which is how it tells the CSS where to show it. Since that's the very last thing we need, all we have to do is take the style now, and we can throw it onto our button. We can say style is style, and now watch this. If I go ahead and save it, go over to our page, I can go pick up this draggable, and boom, Now you can see me actually moving it around with my mouse. I can do it for this one, I can do it for this one, any one of them. If I happen to pick one up and then I suddenly let go of it with my mouse, it snaps back to exactly where it started. Doesn't matter which one it is, it's the same behavior for all of them. And this right here is the most basic demonstration I can show you of Draggables. We don't have any drop zones yet, and we're doing nothing to actually manage the React state with any of these items. However, you can see firsthand that the images you're seeing on the page are valid Draggables. I can grab them, move them around, drop them, and the idea of a drag and drop functionality is here with these items. Any of them can be picked up, moved around as much as we want, and then dropped. We now have one half of the drag and drop equation. We have the drag part of drag and drop, but we're missing the drop part. Like I showed you earlier, the point of drag and drop is that we have these draggables that can be moved inside of drop zones. Right now, our page has 0 drop zones, so there's nowhere to actually place these draggables. That's why they're always just going to snap back to their starting spot. There's nowhere for them to actually go. With that being said, let's now set up a super basic droppable, which I'll be calling drop zone. So in our code here, actually above Draggable, I'm going to make a new component. I'm going to say function drop zone, just like this. And in our return for right here, we will just render out a self-closing div. And how we set up a drop zone is honestly very similar to how we set up a draggable. However, instead of calling use draggable, we can call use droppable. So up here, I'm actually going to copy this whole line and go ahead and paste it in like this. And instead of use draggable, we will just call use droppable. And then for the ID, we're just going to go ahead and hard code it because for right now, we're only going to have one droppable. So we'll go ahead and do that. Make sure this use droppable is imported from Dnd-kit. And same as the other one, we will pull out the set node ref. Again, once we add more rows, we'll be changing this ID to be an actual drop zone ID. But for now, to keep it simple, we'll just have one and hard code it to droppable. And actually, since we're semantically calling these drop zones, let's go ahead and call this drop zone as well. And then, just like Draggable, the way that we can tell Dnd-kit which element is the true drop zone, we just throw a ref on the element that we want and pass through set node ref. So we only have one div here. This will say ref equals set node ref, just like this. Let's throw some super quick styles on this div to make it actually look like something. We'll give it a class name. I'll just say border white, which you won't see yet. And then for the background, I'll just say 333 to get kind of a gray color. We'll say height 30, and we'll also do width full. And what I'll do is just scroll up here, and inside of our D&D context, but outside of where we're mapping our draggables, I'll just render out the drop zone. Again, I want to point out, anytime we're using a Dnd-kit function like use draggable or use droppable, we need to do it within a D&D context, hence why I am putting the drop zone inside D&D context. If we go ahead and save it now, you can see we now have the drop zone and the draggables. This looks pretty horrendous, so let's throw a flex call in here so it makes it a vertical layout. And now you can see we have both of these. Let's go ahead and give it some gap just to make some space. So we'll say, I don't know, gap 16. So now up top here, we've got this drop zone taking up the full width of the screen. And then right below it, we have an array of all of our draggables. If we look back at our drop zone here, just like the use draggable hook, the use droppable hook has a bunch of things that we can actually pull out of the hook, in addition to just set node ref. One of those things that tends to be helpful, especially for testing, is a boolean called isOver. This is just a simple boolean that tells us whether or not a draggable is hovering over this drop zone. Just so we're able to see this super clearly, let's make a new style right here. We're going to say const style equals, and this will be a CSS object just like we have in our draggable component. We'll say background color like this, if I can spell. Then we'll say if isOver is true, then we want the background color to be green. Otherwise, no color, so just have it be undefined. Then we'll go ahead and just throw this style on the div like this. So if there's a draggable over the drop zone, we're going to turn the whole thing to green. Otherwise, just do nothing. So let's go ahead and save it and see what happens. If I take a draggable like this, move it over the drop zone, it now turns green. This works whether it's this draggable, or any other draggable. Again, if I hover over it, it turns green. As soon as I get out of it, it turns back to gray. Green when I hover, gray when I don't. This is exactly how we can tell that this drop zone is properly registered in our D&D context. If I hover over it with a draggable, we actually have an event firing that Dnd-kit is completely managing, without us really having to do anything. That tells it that the draggable is currently hovering over the drop zone. Under the hood, they're doing all sorts of collision detection logic that we don't really have to worry about. That's what's nice about this library. So now that we've got this confirmation that we have draggables and we can actually drag them over a drop zone, The next logical question is, what actually happens when we drop this draggable if it's over the drop zone? Let's see. If I have this draggable hovering the drop zone right here, and then let go of my mouse, abracadabra, nothing happens at all. And that is because Dnd-kit does not manage this state for us. It gives us the proper events, collision detection and all, that lets us know what is happening, but it is up to us to set the react state to actually drop the draggable in the drop zone. So Dnd-kit will not handle me actually dropping this and this just automatically, magically ending up in the drop zone. We have to handle that internally, but they expose events for us that we can use to do that. How do we do that? Well, if we go to the Dnd-kit docs again here, let's go to get started. I can go to the Dnd-context, which again is kind of the core of this whole thing. And if I scroll down to the API right here, let me zoom in a bit so you can see a bit better. We have these events right here, namely these 5 that all expose events to us: on drag start, on drag move, on drag over, on drag end, and on drag cancel. The 3 that we'll be focusing on, which are probably the most important, is on drag start, on drag over, and on drag end. Whenever I pick up a draggable, meaning any draggable at all, this on drag start is going to fire. As soon as I hover over a drop zone, on drag over will fire. And then once I let go of my mouse, on drag end will fire. So basically, if I want to handle logic that actually drops my draggable inside the drop zone, I need to use the on drag end event. As soon as I let go of my mouse, I need it to just go inside of the drop zone. Let me show you this in action. All I have to do is go up here into our app, and let's make a function for that. We'll say const handle drag end, just like this. Make it an arrow function. And this function will just take in a single event, which we'll call E, and its type is going to be DragEnd event directly from Dnd-kit. To hook up this function to our Dnd-context, all we have to do is give Dnd-context a prop that is just called onDragEnd. And then we can pass through our handle dragEnd function just like this. Now, whenever a drag event ends, so I take a draggable and I let go of it like this handle dragEnd function is going to fire. Just to give you a very basic idea of what this event looks like, in this handle dragEnd event here, I'm going to console log E right here. Let's go ahead and save this. To show you this in action, I'll go ahead and open up my DevTools here. Let's go ahead and take a draggable, which it's super tiny, probably hard for you to see it. I'll go ahead and drop it in the drop zone so you can see it turn green. I'll let go of my mouse and boom, we get this event that logs out. If I go ahead and let me zoom in for you to see a bit better. Go ahead and expand this. We have a couple of fields in this object. This event right here is going to tell us quite a few things about what happened with the drag. But most important, this event for us right now are these 2 fields. We have this active one right here, and we also have this over one. Active tells us the draggable that we were just dragging. Over tells us which drop zone we were just hovering over. Both active and over give us the ID. So right here, this ID is the ID of the draggable that I dragged. The over is the ID of the drop zone that I went over. Because the active and the over events tells us exactly what we were dragging and exactly what we were over, that will be really helpful for us in setting our React state. With that information, knowing that each the active and the over give us an ID, let's go ahead and close this and start writing some code. First things first, in this handle dragEnd function right below our console log, let's just say if not e.over, we're going to go ahead and return. This right here is just a function guard, which I love to use in cases like this. Basically, if we're not hovering a drop zone, just completely jump out of this function without question. Because at least for right now, we don't want to do anything else if there's not even a drop zone being hovered. If I were to take a draggable like this, and I dropped it out here, not even close to being in a drop zone, over is going to be undefined. So this check right here is going to cover for that. If we're not over a drop zone, we don't even want to do anything. Just let the draggable snap back to its original position, which it will do automatically. What this means now is that below this return here, anything in this space that we fill out is going to be when we're hovering over a drop zone. And this is where updating state comes into play. Whenever we drop the draggable into the drop zone, we need to use this event right here, this E, to somehow set some React state to update which draggables are inside the drop zone and which ones are outside. How we can do that is actually fairly simple. What we can do is on every single one of our draggables, we're going to add a DZ property. We're going to say DZ, and we're going to say it's going to be an optional string. All of these to start off with are going to be undefined, meaning they don't have a drop zone, meaning they're just sitting outside of one. So I'll take this DZ undefined, actually this here. Now I'll go ahead and paste it on every single one of these. That way, each one knows whether it's in a drop zone or whether it's not in a drop zone. With this, here's what we can do. Right now, whenever we're mapping over our items to show all of our draggables down here, we're just going over all of them. However, we're going to assume that the draggables that are down here at the bottom are the free draggables, meaning they don't have an associated drop zone. So in our map here, before we do our actual map, let's go ahead and filter. We're going to say for each draggable, we're only going to map over it if it does not have a drop zone. So we'll say not draggable.dz. So basically, if draggable is undefined, that's the only case where we're actually going to show these draggables. If an item has a drop zone, it's not going to be displayed here at the bottom. What this means is in our drop zone, we want to do the exact opposite. In our drop zone, we only want to display items that actually do have a drop zone and are not undefined. So let's go ahead and to make this easy for now, go ahead and pass draggables down to drop zone. So we'll say draggables, just going to be draggables, which is of a draggable array type. And then we'll make sure to pass it down up here. So we'll say draggables equals draggables just like this. And now, instead of this div right here being self-closing, let's make it accept children. What we'll do is go ahead and give it another thing on the class name here. We will just say flex gap 4 to space out our draggables that are going to be inside of it. And now, inside of this div, we're going to do the exact opposite of right here, where we're taking the draggables that don't have a drop zone. So I'll actually take this exact code right here. Let's go ahead and copy it. Let's paste it right here. And let's just move this back a little bit. Let's just invert this condition. So we'll just remove the not here. So we're only filtering for draggables that actually do have a drop zone. And then for each draggable, we're rendering a draggable component. And now that we have this, we can go ahead and save it. Nothing's going to change visually because these all will still start with an undefined drop zone, meaning they're not inside of one. But now we have the actual infrastructure to do what I want to do next. And that's the logic inside handle DragEnd that will actually set our draggable state to the new and updated state. Let's take care of that real quick. First, let's capture both the ID of the active draggable and the ID of the drop zone that we're over. To do that, we'll just say const drop zone ID, just like this, equals e.over.id. And just to make sure it gets parsed as a string, I'm going to typecast it to a string. And then to get the draggable ID, we'll do a very similar thing. We'll say const active draggable ID equals e.active.id as string. Again, when you looked at the events, e.overID is the drop zone that we're hovering over. e.active.id is the draggable that we're actually clicking on and holding with our mouse. Once we have this, all we need to do now is call set draggables to actually update our state. Because we're talking about an array, we're going to go ahead and say previous, get that out of here, and we're going to do previous.map. In React, whenever you're updating an array or object that's in React state, you either need to spread or construct a new array or object just like this. All we'll say in our map is just this. We'll say for each draggable, we're going to say draggable.id is not equal to active draggable ID. So if this is the case, meaning the current item in the list has nothing to do with the active draggable, we're just going to return the existing draggable. So we'll say draggable. Otherwise, oops, this should be active draggable ID, if I could spell it. So if it has nothing to do with it, we're just going to return the draggable itself. Otherwise, if it does have something to do with it, that means it's the draggable that we just dropped. So this is the item in question. So we will take an object here. We're going to spread in the existing draggable, but just throw the new drop zone on it. We'll just say drop zone ID, just like this. And now, if I save it, it's going to format it, and our state's going to be actually updating something. Again, just to reiterate, whenever you have a state array in React, you want to make sure you either spread in or map over the previous to construct the new array. All we're saying is, for all of the items that we have, or all the draggables, if the draggable ID is not the active one, that means we don't care about it. It can just be whatever it was before this happened. However, if it is, meaning this else case, then we just spread the existing value, but just throw the new and updated drop zone on it. And that's all it really is. Now that we have this, watch the magic happen. If I go over here, pick up this barbarian, go over the drop zone and drop him, boom, he snaps inside of it. If I take this bomber here, same thing, dark prince, baby dragon, they all go in the drop zone. Just to show you again, I'll start fresh with a refresh here, take one of these, it goes green so we know I'm hovering over the drop zone, I let go, and it drops inside. Every single one is just dropping in, completely clean, just like clockwork. This logic right here is going to be the basis of our tier list. We still got quite a ways to go, but this core logic right here is going to be essential towards getting our drag and drop functionality working. Again, I want to emphasize that Dnd-kit simply exposes the event information with this event right here, the DragEnd event, and it gives us the context of what's being dragged and where it's being dropped. It's up to us to handle the React state side of it, just like we're doing with this set Draggables right here and our Draggables array. What this allows for is a lot of flexibility in how we do things. Because Dnd-kit gives just the context to what's going on, it gives us the freedom to essentially do whatever we want, just like in this case here. Now that we've got this core functionality figured out, what's the next step? Well, before we start figuring out how to get multiple rows on top of each other and build out the multiple tiers of our tier list, we're still missing one key functionality. And that's the functionality to sort items within their own row. For example, if I again start fresh here, I take one of the Draggables and then I drop, I don't know, maybe let's say 3 of these in here. I don't have an actual good way to pick up one of these and sort it again in the drop zone. Every time I try and redrop it, it just ends up going to the exact same spot it was before. So right now I literally have no way to rearrange these items in the row if I want to. But I've got good news, and that's that Dnd-kit has custom functionality for sortable rows and columns of things in a drag and drop interface. If you recall, when we first started this project, I had you install Dnd-kit/sortable as an extra plugin. And that's what we're going to utilize to be able to reorder these items within their own row. Let's simplify this real quick while we figure out our sorting. I'm going to comment out this entire chunk right here where we're mapping over our free Draggables. I'm just going to have the drop zone. In our drop zone, instead of filtering the items to only show the ones that do have a drop zone, we're just going to take this off and just show all of our items. So if we save it, we already have all of our items just in our drop zone. This will make it easier while we figure out sorting within a single row. There are 2 essential things we need in order to support a sortable, draggable row. The first is wherever we're mapping over our items in our drop zone, we need to wrap this in a sortable context. Sortable context comes from Dnd-kit. We can do that by going down here, actually up here to our drop zone. We can see they're all being wrapped right here. We can actually Control-Shift-P, wrap, and we're going to wrap this in a sortable context, just like this. This sortable context, like I said, will be imported from Dnd-kit sortable. This sortable context has one prop that it needs to function properly, and that is just items. Items needs to be an array. If we pass in items equals Draggables, just like this, however, it's not going to quite work. What it really should be, to be semantically correct, is an array of IDs, not just an array of items. Right now, Draggables is this Draggable type, which has the ID, source, and the drop zone property. So instead of being a whole array containing all this information, we just want it to be an array of IDs. To do that, it's actually pretty simple. All we have to do is in here, we can say Draggables.map, and for each Draggable, we're just going to map it to a Draggable ID, and that will create our array of IDs. We're just simply constructing a new array of pure IDs from the existing Draggables array. And now we've made this sortable context happy. The only other thing we actually need to support sorting is to change a single line. Right now, in our Draggable component, we're using this useDraggable hook. If you want to use a sortable Draggable row, we just need to change this hook here to instead be useSortable instead of useDraggable. UseSortable is a hook that essentially is useDraggable under the hood, but just extends its functionality to allow sorting within a sorting context. So all the same stuff right here, like setNodeRef, listeners, and all this, we can still pull out. Because useSortable and useDraggable, like I said, are pretty much the same thing. UseSortable just has a few extra things on it. Now that these Draggables are using the useSortable hook, and we've wrapped our Draggables in the sortable context here, let me go and save this and show you the magic happening. If I pick up a Draggable and start moving it, you can see that items are now moving out of the way. So I have the baby dragon on my mouse here. If I move it to the right, things start moving out of the way for it. Just like you would expect a sortable list to work. All this just works pretty cleanly. As we go, we're essentially just swapping spots every single time I move this to the right or to the left. Cool, so now what? Well, if I drop this while it's over here per se, let it go, it's always going to snap back to its starting spot, just like the OG Draggables. If I have this here as a third item, move it over here to the very end, go ahead and drop it, it's still going to return to being the third item. Our handle DragEnd does not account for sorting. For whenever we stop the sorting and dragging, nothing actually happens because we're not setting state. So let's go ahead and scroll up to our handle DragEnd function and take care of that. First things first, let's get rid of our set Draggables right here. This was good to give us a starting idea and for me to show you kind of the core functionality, but we'll have to rework this now that we have sorting involved. Second, before we add more logic, let's rename this variable right here. The reason I say I want to rename dropZone_ID is because when sorting is involved, now it's not just a drop zone that we can be hovering over. It can be a draggable or a drop zone. And this is a super important key feature of doing sorting with Dnd-kit. What I mean by that is if I take the baby dragon right here and I swap with the barbarian, I'm actually hovering over the barbarian, not the drop zone. So what I'm saying is this e.over.id can be another draggable now and not just a drop zone. So this can be a draggable or a drop zone. I can actually prove this to you if I go ahead and save this here, open up the console once again here, and then I can't really see because they're way too small. Let's say I just take one of these draggables, I hover it over, and I let go. Now we get this event that logs out right here. I'll shrink this back down. If you look, this ID right here for the over object is now this big long string. We know because it's this big long string that this is a draggable ID, because draggable IDs are just this random UUID. If it were the drop zone, it would just say ID drop zone. So now with sortables, we have active elements that are actually going over these over elements, and they're both draggables at the same time. So the reason I'm saying all this is because I want to rename this drop zone ID to instead just be over ID, because that is technically more semantically correct. Over ID can be either a draggable ID or a drop zone ID. In the context of sorting, the draggable that you're over is going to be super important, because that's what tells us how our item should shift to accommodate the move. And now that we have this, let's go ahead and call set draggables with a slightly different approach this time. So we'll go ahead and get the previous draggables, and we'll go ahead and make this a function. And now we need to ask ourselves what exactly we want to happen when the DragEnd event happens. Well, ideally, we track the index of the draggable that we pick up. For example, if I took the baby dragon right here, this is at index 0, 1, 2. So it's at index 2. Ideally, we keep track of that index. And then we figure out wherever it's dropped, what is the new index that it should be dropped at. And then if we have both the old index, like right here, and then we have the new index, like right here, then we can shift all of our items to accommodate the move. So let's find the indices first. For the original index, all we have to do is say const, we'll call it old index equals previous. Oops, I should be doing this inside of set draggables. We'll say const old index equals previous, and we'll call the find index method. And we're going to say, I want to find the draggable where the draggable ID matches the active draggable ID. And that's because when this event fires, nothing has changed yet. So if I take this baby dragon right here, start moving it around, and I end over here, no matter what, as soon as it gets dropped over here, this old index is still equal to 2. So this index will still be 2 right here. And then to get the new index to see where it is dropped, we just have to do the exact same thing, but with the over ID instead of the active draggable ID. So we can go ahead and copy this old index right here. We can paste it in. We can just call this new index. And again, instead of doing active draggable ID, all we have to do is check for over ID. So to visualize this, again, let's say I take baby dragon. We know this starts at index 2. I'm going to move this to index 3, 4, 5 right here. If I drop this here, our new index variable is equal to 5. So old index is 2, new index is 5. The reason that the new index is 5, for instance, if we go 3, 4, 5, is because when this DragEnd event fires, 5 is actually the original index of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's this dark prince card right here. However, notice when the DragEnd event hits right here, that's the actual draggable that we're hovering over. Because we're taking its place exactly where it was before, that's why this is now index 5. And that's why it makes sense to take the over ID when finding the new index. Another example, this Mega Knight right here is at index 1 to start off, so old index is equal to 1. If I go here, now new index is equal to 3. Old index is 1, new index is 3. Cool. So once we have that information, what do we actually do with it? Well, just as a quick safeguard, before we set any state, let's make another function guard. Let's just say if old index is equal to new index, just return the previous value. This means there was no meaningful change and nothing actually really happened, so let's just go ahead and return early. Otherwise, if we get down here, that means that they're not the same, so some shifting needs to happen. So the question is, we have the old index and we have the new index. How do we shift the items properly without doing some crazy array manipulation or complex mapping? Well, lucky for us, Dnd-kit provides a function called arrayMove that does exactly this. All we need to do in our set items now is say return arrayMove, imported from Dnd-kit, and it needs 3 arguments, all of which we have. The first argument is the Draggables, or the items that we're talking about, so we can just pass in previous. The second is old index, and the third is new index. If we pass these 3 things in, Dnd-kit will take care of the magic. So if I go ahead and save this now we have all the logic for our sorting. If I go over here, take baby dragon, move it past barbarian, drop it, boom, it updates in place. I'll take the, dark prince here, move it where the P.E.K.K.A is, drop it, and boom, now it stays in place. You get the idea. No matter which Draggable I pick up, I can pick it up, I can move it somewhere, drop it, and it actually stays there. If I want this P.E.K.K.A here, I can move it here. I want this prince here, I'll put him here, and you get the picture. So now, with just this slight adjustment to handle DragEnd and the way that we're handling sorting and shifting items, we've now just created support for sorting items within a container while also being draggable inside of a drop zone. We're now starting to get more into the nitty-gritty of things, but this is huge progress and will allow us a lot of flexibility as we build out our tier list. There's a few other things we need to consider with this sortable container, however. Issue number 1. If I pick up a draggable like this barbarian right here and try to move it somewhere outside of the sortable row, it immediately snaps back to the starting point. No matter what I do, it always does this. This is going to be a huge problem for a couple of reasons. First of all, if I can't move a draggable outside of its own row, how will I ever get it to move between different rows of a tier list? There's no way for me to possibly do it if every item is just locked to its own row. Also, assuming we start with all the draggables at the very bottom, outside all of the rows, how will I ever put them inside of a row, again, if they can't leave their own sortable context? This is going to be a huge problem, so we need to fix this ASAP. The way that Dnd-kit recommends you handle this kind of case is by using one of their components called DragOverlay. And this is something that you'll probably see pretty often with Dnd-kit. By default, whenever we're using sortable context, a draggable only exists within its own context. But if you use DragOverlay, it will exist on the whole page, and we don't have to worry about this issue. So again, without DragOverlay, it cannot exist outside of its own context, so it just snaps back. If we use DragOverlay, I can pick it up and move it anywhere. The way that we can do it is like this. First, inside of our D&D context right here, but outside of our drop zone, so I don't want to put it inside of here. I want to put it, let's say, below this comment right here. We're going to make a new component rendering. We're going to say DragOverlay, imported from Dnd-kit, and it'll take in children. And then we're going to want to do something kind of like this, where we render out a draggable inside of this DragOverlay. The idea with DragOverlay is that we're essentially going to be mounting another instance of the draggable while we're dragging, and that will be this DragOverlay right here. It will be positioned relative to the viewport, that way it can exist across any number of sortable or droppable containers. So the typical flow would be, we have a bunch of draggables that are already placed, we pick one up, and whichever one we pick up will effectively be rendered twice in the DOM. One for the original element that will just kind of sit where it was before, and then one additional one for the DragOverlay that we're actually moving with our mouse. This is a bit of a weird thing conceptually, so I think it'll make more sense when I start to build it out. It solves all of our issues with this sortable context thing and allows us to build a functional tier list, but it does add a little bit of complexity. Problem number 1, we render the draggable in here just like this. However, this draggable needs an actual draggable element to go into it. Because again, our draggables are expecting an actual draggable prop to be passed down, just like we're doing with our drop zones. So up here, all the way up here, how do we know which draggable to actually pass in right here? And the answer is right now we don't, which is why we'll have to add some React state to keep track of which draggable is actually the one actively being dragged. To do that, up here we can make a new state. We can just say const active draggable, set active draggable equals useState. It's going to be of type draggable, and by default, it'll be undefined. This will just be the state that we're going to use to keep track of what's currently being dragged. How do we actually know which draggable is currently being dragged though? Like, where does this actually get set? Well, we would have to call this set active draggable as soon as the drag starts. Luckily, earlier I showed you with Dnd-context, we have a few functions we can hook into. One of which was this onDragStart right here. So on the drag start, we need to set the active draggable to whatever draggable is in question. Meaning, what I can do here is just like we have this handle DragEnd function, I'm going to make one for handle drag start. I'm going to say handle drag start equals, It will also be an event. This time it is drag start event. This is also just going to be a function. All we have to do now in this function, this handle drag start, is call set active draggable like this and set it to the draggable in question. But how do we know which draggable is actually the one being dragged? If we look at our handle drag end function right here, we know we can get the active draggable ID with the e.active.id. However, this is just the ID. It doesn't actually return us the entire draggable. So if I were to try and pass in like e.active.id like this here, this wouldn't be correct because I'm just setting the ID, but I need to know what the whole draggable is. I need this whole entire object. All we have to do is find which draggable that we're actually talking about. We can just say const active draggable, just like this, equals draggables.find. And then for each draggable, we're going to say find where the draggable.id is equal to the active ID. This will actually return to us the entire draggable object that is in question that matches the active ID. So if, for example, we pick up the, I don't know, the bomber card like this, the e.active.id will be this ID right here. And the active draggable we get with this find will be this entire object. So now we can just say set active draggable just like this. And now whenever the drag starts, we're actually setting the draggable to the correct thing. However, now that we've done this, we'll want to be sure to clean up properly. Once the DragEnd event fires, we need to set this back to undefined so we're cleaning up the state properly. So inside of our handle DragEnd here, at the very bottom after everything is said and done, let's go ahead and say set active draggable, and we're just going to set it back to undefined. And we'll also want to be wary of early returns because we'll need to clean it up there as well. So right here, we have an early return. Let's say we want to return, and also here, set it back to undefined. And now what we can do right here is we have this handle drag start. So just like the handle drag end, let's plug it into our D&D context. We'll say on drag start, and we'll plug in handle drag start just like this. And now what this allows us to do is use this active draggable state. We're properly setting it whenever the drag starts, and we're cleaning it up whenever the drag ends. So now we assume that while we're dragging, this active draggable is going to be defined. It'll be a draggable, which makes our life actually really easy. All we have to do now is in this DragOverlay, we can pass through the draggable is just active draggable like this. And just to be extra cautious right here, it's going to tell us that this draggable cannot be undefined, which to be fair, it can't. So let's say we only want to render this draggable here if active draggable is actually defined. So if it's defined, we want to render whatever the active draggable is. With this, let's now save it and go ahead and do some testing. If I take this baby dragon right here, I can take it and I can move it literally anywhere in the screen. So I'm in the white space up here, white space over here, and now I can move it anywhere I want. Before, the second that I moved it out of its own context, it would just snap back because it didn't know what to do. Now, I can move it literally anywhere I want. And this is the exact functionality we're going to want for an actual functional tier list. Doesn't matter if I'm inside the sortable context or way outside of it. It just works. However, there are two immediate problems that I'm noticing right away. The first one, and this is completely expected right now, is that whenever I pick up a draggable, we have two instances of it. Like I said a moment ago, whenever we're using DragOverlay, this is the intended behavior. This one right here that is moving with my mouse is the draggable that is rendered here. The one that's staying there in the row is the draggable that's still being rendered inside of our drop zone. So whenever something is active, we're going to be rendering two at the exact same time. It's up to us, not Dnd-kit, to hide or lower the opacity on the draggable that isn't actively being dragged. Secondly, in addition to this, we don't really have any fluid animations. Whenever I drop one, it kind of moves back in, but we don't have any animations between these, especially when using DragOverlay. So let's fix both those two problems, starting with the more important one of having duplicates. In order to fix the first issue of being two draggables visible at once, we'll need to restructure the code just a little bit. When I said you should render the draggable like this inside of DragOverlay, I was only half telling the truth. If you think about it, the item inside the DragOverlay is not actually a draggable. So when I go here, take this barbarian card, and I have this DragOverlay following my mouse, this is not actually technically a draggable component. It's purely visual content. And if you look at the Dnd-kit docs, it specifically says not to render your draggable component in DragOverlay. Rather, you should just render the image or whatever's inside the draggable to ensure that it's purely visual. And the reason I'm saying all this is that remember that each of our draggables is registered with its own unique ID. If I am rendering two actual draggable components at the same time, for example, this barbarian, I'm going to have two draggables with the exact same ID in the D&D context at the same time, and that is not ideal. It could introduce complexities and most likely will introduce bugs if we start to get more complicated later on. So with that being said, what I'm hinting at here is splitting out the visual content of our draggable from the actual button itself. So basically just splitting out this image to be its own thing instead of all just being baked into this one draggable. So what I can do is actually pretty simple. I can make a function down here. I will say function draggable content, just like this. We're going to return, and I'm going to copy just the inner contents of this draggable, so the image right here. And that's what's going to be returned inside of here. Let's make sure our draggable content can also take down the entire draggable as a prop. So we'll go ahead and take this type right here, add it here. We're going to go ahead and replace this image with our new draggable content. So just the visual content like this. And we'll of course pass down our draggable to make it happy. And then from here, we can get the source again just by destructuring. We can say const source equals draggable, just like this. What we can do now to fix all the problems that we're having is we can go to the DragOverlay here, and instead of rendering out the draggable, we can instead just render out draggable content like this. Now this will be a purely visual component. If we, with that logic, go ahead and test it, it's not really going to change anything. It's going to behave just the way that it did before. But what it allows us to do is something really nice. We can pass in an additional prop inside of our draggable content right here called isDragging. This way, we know if the draggable content is actually the one that's being dragged. So we'll say isDragging. This is going to be a Boolean. It'll be an optional Boolean. And what we're going to say is where we're doing our drag overlay, we're just going to pass in isDragging is equal to true. That way in our draggable content, we know this one is the one being dragged. What this means for us is we can go ahead and give this image right here a style tag. And what we can do is we can just say opacity, if it is the one being dragged, so if it's dragging, opacity 1, otherwise opacity 0. That way, if we're the draggable content inside the drag overlay, we show it, otherwise just use opacity 0 to hide the one that isn't being dragged. But wait, if we go ahead and save this, it's going to hide every single draggable because that makes them all opacity 0. Because now every single draggable that is not being dragged literally means all of them. It doesn't discriminate based on whether it's the active one or not. So this style condition right here, when we're changing the opacity, needs to only apply for the draggable content that's actually being dragged, not to every single one. So we need to find a way to get this active draggable from all the way up here, all the way down into draggable content here. We have two main options with a secret third option. Option 1 is we could prop drill active draggable all the way down to draggable content. We could take it up here, pass it down to draggable, actually pass it down to draggable content and to drop zone, which would then pass it to draggable here. So we're basically drilling it all the way down just to get into this component. That's option 1. Completely viable, keeps it in the context of React, but prop drilling is super annoying. Option 2, we could use a context to wrap everything right here, just some custom context that we define, pass the active draggable through the context, and then call use context within draggable content to extract that value. Both of these are completely fine, but I have an easier way. If you've watched me in the past, you know that I love the library Jotai to do basically this exact thing. It's a super tiny package that gives you a useState-esque function that avoids context and prop drilling and doing a bunch of annoying stuff. To get it, all you have to do is go into your terminal. You just have to run npmi Jotai just like this. And how we use it is honestly super simple. Outside of our component, I'll go at the very top here, we can make an atom. So we can say const active draggable atom. An atom is going to be from Jotai. It's going to be of type draggable, and it's going to start out as undefined. And instead of using useState for active draggable like we're doing right here, we can actually use atom instead. And what we do right here is just pass in active draggable atom just like this. And actually we don't need this draggable here because it's already defined with the atom. So essentially we can take this useAtom here that is just a useState type thing. We can get the actual state itself and we get the setter function for the state. The difference between useAtom and useState is that now I can access this value anywhere I want in my entire app. It's atomic state, which is why these are called atoms. So to do that, to make this super simple, the reason why I'm doing this whole thing here is now I can go into draggable content down here and I can say const active draggable equals useAtom value just like this. and take an active draggable atom. This will be imported from Jotai. And now I have it down here in the component, zero prop drilling and no context spamming. You don't have to use Jotai if you don't want, but in this case, I think it makes sense and makes it pretty nice and easy to work with. If you want more information on how Jotai works, I have a whole video on it that I'll put in the description. Now that we have the active draggable down here, now what? Well, what we can actually do now is we can get the ID out of here. Let's call this active draggable ID. And we're just going to say .id just like this to get the ID of the draggable that is being dragged. Now we know the ID of the existing draggable that we're in, which is just the draggable.id, so we can get it out of here. So we have the ID and we have the active draggable ID. What does this allow us to do now? Well, it allows us to actually fix this condition. Every single draggable should always show. However, when we're dragging a draggable, we want to hide the non-DragOverlay version of the draggable. What's the condition for that? Well, all we have to do here is instead of just saying is dragging, we can say is dragging or active draggable ID is not equal to ID. So if it's the content that's actually being dragged, so is dragging, opacity is always going to be 1, no questions asked. If the IDs don't match, meaning it's every other draggable, we want to show that too. The only time we'd ever hide it and hit the 0 case for opacity is if we're the draggable that's just sitting there while we've got the drag overlay going. Let me show you what I mean by this. If I go ahead and save it now, all of our draggables should reappear. If I pick up this draggable, now you can see the spot where it came from is completely empty. The spot that was holding the barbarian there before is completely gone. So now it looks like we only have one instance going at a time. This is what it's going to start looking like when I start moving stuff around. I don't have any weird duplicate state happening that makes it look super ugly. Now it just looks super smooth. I can move things around and sort them, and I can move it anywhere on the entire page. The reason I'm using opacity 0 like this and doing this condition is because I still want it to take up space in the DOM. So whenever I pull a barbarian out like this, I want that hole to not close right away. I want it to still be there because that indicates where it's going to fall back to. We know if the hole's there, it's going to snap back to that position. This part is up to you, but if you want, you can make this opacity not 0, but instead something like 0.5. So if I did that, for example, like 0.5, go ahead and saved it. When I pick this up, you can see the outline of where it's going to drop, and this still gives you a clue to where it's going to drop, but it shows you that it's not the actual active draggable being dragged. That's still the one of the mouse, but you can see where it's going to land. So I can do it like this. If I want it to be 0.2, make it even more dim, you can see it very faintly now where it's going to drop or end up. This is up to you, more of a stylistic thing. I'm going to go ahead and keep it at 0, so we're essentially just completely hiding whatever is not actively being dragged. Alright, so that's problem 1 out of the way. We don't have duplicate draggables as long as we're dragging something, and using the drag overlay is able to go anywhere on the screen, but still work within the context of the sortable context by moving items out of the way. What was the next issue that we had? Well, I mentioned that we don't really have support for animations, so let's actually add those real quick. If we go to our draggable right here, we still have all this stuff that we're pulling out of the use sortable hook. While we're here, we don't need this anymore. Go ahead and get rid of that. One of the things we can pull out of here is actually a thing just called transition. And this will allow us to animate whenever we're sorting something. If I go transition here, go ahead and save it. Let's just refresh just to be sure. Now whenever I move things, they're going to animate. However, we're going to notice one problem with this. The items aren't going to animate all the time. For example, this just snapped to place. It didn't animate. But now if I go back, it will animate. Snaps, animates. So basically, sometimes when I go a certain direction, or I go back to its starting spot, it'll animate perfectly and look super smooth, but other times it just kind of snaps into place and doesn't animate properly. So let's go ahead and fix that so we can get both the drag overlay and super smooth and crisp animations working. The root cause of this issue is that our React state doesn't actually get updated until the DragEnd event. All the logic for doing the update is inside of handle DragEnd. Because our state isn't updating, and our state is what determines the order and display of things, Dnd-kit is trying its best to figure out which draggables need to be animated and when, but it's not quite getting it right. Because if we're not updating the state every time we drag something, and we're only doing it on the end, there's no way for it to possibly know which things we're trying to animate. Luckily for us, there's a very simple way to fix this, and that's using optimistic state updates. Instead of only setting state when the drag event ends, we need to update it as it is happening. So earlier, when I was going over the different events you can do with the drag and drop, we had the on drag start, on DragOver, and on DragEnd. Those are the main three. Right now, we're doing the on drag start, and we're also doing the onDragEnd. What we're not using at all is this onDragOver right here, but that is the exact event we need to hook into. The reason why I say this is super easy and we won't have to rewrite a bunch of our logic is that we can pretty much just copy and paste exactly what we already have inside of our handle DragEnd. So I'm going to go up here. I'm going to make const handle DragOver. It's going to be an event where we use a DragOver event. What's nice is that they provide pretty convenient types for all of these, like this. Again, make an arrow function, and just like before, we'll plug each of these in. We'll say onDragOver equals handle DragOver, just like this. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take all of this literally exactly from the handle DragEnd, copy it, and we're going to paste it into handle DragOver. Let's get rid of the console log, and we can get rid of two things here. Anywhere where we're setting the active draggable to undefined. If we're dragging over something, we don't actually want to stop any active draggable state. We don't want to set it back to undefined. Because if I take something like this draggable here, and go over the baby dragon, I don't want to reset this active draggable to be nothing. So we can just get rid of this entirely, because it's a drag over, not a drag end. So we'll say this, remove that here, get rid of the console log here, and all we've effectively done is move the logic from handle DragEnd to handle DragOver. So now we're going to update the state every single time our active draggable hovers over something else. So if I take this Mega Knight here and I hover over the skeleton, we're going to immediately update the state. That way we can get everything working crisp and smooth, including the animations. Because we now have all of our logic in handle DragOver, we do not need this in handle DragEnd anymore. All we have to do is make sure that these two functions, handle DragStart and handle DragEnd, are effectively one-to-one. What I'm implying by that is in this one, we're setting the active draggable to some state. So in the DragEnd, we need to set it to be back to undefined. We can literally just remove this entire thing from the handle DragEnd, and all we're doing now in the DragEnd is saying, okay, set it back to undefined. So on start, we set it to something. Whenever a DragOver happens like this, we handle the state update instantly, and then once we drop it, then we set the active draggable back to undefined. This is going to be the proper and most mature flow for more complex D&D use cases. It was a bit different for the initial setup, just so I could show you kind of what was going on. However, now that you have a better understanding, and we've been doing it for a while, this is the mindset you should typically approach. Handle DragStart sets whatever start state is needed. Handle DragEnd cleans that state up. And then handle DragOver is usually where almost all the logic is actually held. We want to update optimistically and update as soon as it happens, not just wait for the DragEnd event. Now if I go ahead and save it, let me show you this in action now. Go ahead and refresh just to get on a clean slate here. I'll take Mega Knight, move it here, and it animates smoothly over. We instantly update the state, and we can still drop it in place. So no matter which direction I go, whether it's left or right, we are smoothly animating the items out of the way. Super simple and super smoothly. The reason these items still drop into place whenever we end the drag event is because they're already in the correct spot. If I take this Dark Prince here and I want to swap with Barbarian, I can go here and I'm already in the correct spot. So as soon as I let go, it just snaps back to that spot. All the functionality happens in the onDragOver, and then the onDragStart and onDragEnd are purely for start and cleanup. This is going to be the case 90% of the time for things that are more complex, especially when we're involving sorting. This right here is one of the most complicated parts of this app out of the way. We have the functionality for moving and sorting items within its own container, and the state updates happen perfectly the way we want them to. I can take Baby Dragon from here, move him to the very end, everything animates smoothly, I can drop him and it works perfectly. I can take the miner here, move him around all up here in the bottom, bring him back in, start shifting him around, take him here, shift all these, insert him here, move it around, and it works just the way that you'd expect it to. Now that we have all of this figured out, we can finally start connecting the dots. We have the base level architecture, so the foundation is built, we just need to start expanding. The first step on the agenda should be to reconnect functionality to have draggables that start outside of the sortable context. Obviously, when we first make a tier list, all the items are going to start at the bottom, and none of the rows are going to start filled up. It's up to the user to move them in. Earlier, we went ahead and commented out the code that had our draggables outside of the drop zone, right here. Let's go ahead and uncomment this to display these again. And I want to point out that all of our items have a DZ property appear, or all of our draggables, to show which drop zone they're in. These free items down here we know are free because drop zone is undefined. Ones that do not have an undefined drop zone are not free. So in our draggables, let's make about half of these have the droppable. Actually, I think what was the ID? Drop zone, right? Yeah, so we have the ID as drop zone here. Let's make this DZ drop zone, and let's do on a few of these. Let's just say the first, I don't know, first 5 or so have drop zone just like this. And the other half we're going to keep as undefined. And then what we'll do in the free Draggables, just like we were filtering before, filtering the ones that don't have a drop zone, let's do the exact same thing for the ones in the drop zone. So we'll add the filter here, and it will be the inverse condition, only ones that do have a drop zone. Now if we go ahead and save it and refresh, half of our Draggables are inside the drop zone and half of them are outside. Here's what happens right now if we try and take a Draggable from the outside and try to move it inside. Nothing. Even though it animates out of the way like this, nothing actually happens here. It just snaps back to its original starting position. To fix this, we need to slightly adjust our handle drag over function up here. Nowhere in this code right here does it ever actually set the drop zone. And we know that in order to display these properly, this DZ property needs to be set for each one to know whether we're in the drop zone or not. So let's go ahead and add that to handle drag over. We know that we still need to shift the item, so we still need to call this array move function. However, instead of returning array move, let's make a variable for it. I'm going to make a new variable. I'm going to say const shifted items equals, and we're going to take this array move right here so that we store the shifted items in our shifted items variable. And all we need to do now underneath this is just say shifted items at the new index equals whatever the old item was. So we're going to spread it in like this, taking shifted items at new index, and then we're going to go ahead and attach a new drop zone to it. So we'll do DZ drop zone just like this. And now we can just return this shifted items. So now, not only are we shifting the items, but we're also adding DZ drop zone to here so we know that we're in drop zone. All we're saying is go ahead and shift first, and then we're going to find the exact index we want to modify, and we're going to modify it by spreading in the exact existing object that it was before, just adding the new drop zone to it. So now if we go ahead and save it, and I take this draggable right here, for instance, add it right here, drop it in, now it just lands there. I can take another draggable like this, move it right here, and it just goes inside perfectly. So now I can take Draggables from outside and move them in, animations look smooth, and it all works cleanly. So now, not only are we shifting the items to move out of the way, but we're setting the DZ property to the correct value. That way our Draggables have exact context to where they are, and state updates properly. Now that we have that, we need to make sure we get the inverse working. So if I put an item into a row like this, and suddenly I want to take this and move it back to down here, I can't do that. Right now our functionality is not going to let us. And that's because in our handle drag over right here, of course, we're just hard coding as DZ to drop zone. But if I'm moving from the drop zone to outside, obviously this won't cut it, because if we're moving it from inside to outside, it's no longer just the drop zone. So we need to actually figure out whether we're inside of the drop zone or we're outside. But first, we need to wrap our free items in a sortable context. Right now, if you look down here, our free items are just in this div right here. So sorting is never going to work properly until we wrap it in a sortable context, just like we're doing with our drop zone right here. We need to have pretty much this exact same logic right here. So what we can do is we can scroll up here. Let's highlight this entire div right here. Control-Shift-P, wrap. We're going to wrap it in a sortable context, which is already imported from Dnd-kit. And remember, we need to pass in items, which should be an array of IDs. The items that we're mapping over are these right here. So let's make a variable for this actually to make it a bit simpler. Let's say const free Draggables equals Draggables.filter. And we're going to filter the Draggables that only have an undefined drop zone, meaning they are free and not in a drop zone. And then what we can do is we can go ahead and just replace this whole thing with just free Draggables because I took it verbatim. And then for the items here, all you have to do is map it to an array of IDs. So we'll say free Draggables.map, Draggable, and we'll map each one to an ID. Now our items will be happy. Now we can go ahead and save this, and our free Draggables are properly wrapped inside of a sortable context, so we can move forward correctly now. Going back to the handle drag over, the issue at hand is that we're hard coding DZ to be drop zone right here. However, it should only be drop zone if we're actually inside of the drop zone. Otherwise, it needs to be undefined. That way we can allow Draggables to move in to out and out to in. We can fix this with 3 easy lines. First, we have the ID of the Draggable that we're over, and that is in this over ID variable right here. Let's use this over ID to find the actual Draggable itself that we're over. Inside of set items, we can make a new variable where we'll say const over Draggable, just like this, equals previous.find, and we're going to find the Draggable where the Draggable.id is equal to the over ID. So this will return to us the actual Draggable itself. And right below it, we can make another variable that we will say const over drop zone equals, coerce this to a Boolean, over Draggable .dz, and we'll make sure to do optional chaining right here. This over drop zone right here is just going to be a boolean, true or false. If the draggable that we're over has a drop zone, that means the active item we're hovering needs to be placed in that drop zone. So with this, now in our set items down here, instead of just hard coding this right here to drop zone, we can make a ternary. We will just say if we're over a drop zone, then do drop zone. Otherwise, meaning we're not over a drop zone, it should just be undefined. And now that we differentiate whether or not we're over a drop zone, let's go ahead and save it and refresh. If I take a draggable inside of the drop zone, move it outside of the free draggables, boom, everything shifts over, and we're able to do it seamlessly. I can take Barbarian here, take it here, move it outside. I say, okay, I want to move it back in now. Go here, and now it moves back in. What we have now created is the ability to go back and forth from outside of the drop zone to inside, and then inside back to outside. And the only change we made is just checking to see whether we're over the drop zone or we're in the free area. That's all that check is really doing. Now that this is out of the way, there's still one more big thing we need to address before we start making multiple drop zones stacked on top of each other, which is exactly what a tier list is. And that is the behavior of taking an item from one sorting context, like outside here, like the skeleton, and trying to move it to the very end of the drop zone, so at the end here, and then just dropping it. Notice if I drop it right here, nothing actually happens and my draggable simply snaps back to going outside. Earlier, when we didn't have the sortable context, it was super easy to check, okay, are we over the drop zone, then drop it in. But now that we have sorting items, that becomes a bit more complicated and we haven't handled this case yet. No matter what card it is, whether it's Prince or Skeleton here, if I take it to the end, try and drop it, it's never going to actually place. It'll only place if it's inside of the sorting items. Out here, nothing is going to happen. And that is for one simple reason. Right now, in our handle DragOver, when we're calling set Draggables, what's primarily happening that we're returning is simply a shift. We're just figuring out the index where it should be now, the index where it was, and then we're shifting items around. What it does not yet support is dropping an item inside of a drop zone, but outside of the sortable context. The sortable context is only as wide as the items inside are, so it goes from the first draggable right here to the edge of the last draggable. But as you can see, the drop zone is this whole gray box. So any area over here is kind of in this weird zone where we're not inside the sorting, but we're still inside the drop zone. Before we start working on this, I want to make it very visually clear what I'm talking about when I say inside the sortable versus outside the sortable, but inside the drop zone. Let's scroll down to our drop zone real quick right here. To make this more clear and obvious, I'm going to rearrange the structure just a little bit. I'm going to highlight this entire sortable context, go ahead and do Control-Shift-P, wrap, and I'm going to wrap this all in its own div. And on this div, I'm just going to take a class name like this, and I will throw flex gap 4 on it right here. And just to be safe, I'll go ahead and remove gap 4 from this outer div. And then right below this div that we just made, this one right here that wraps the sortable context, I'm going to make another div. And it's going to be self-closing. However, it'll just have a class name. It'll just be BG yellow 500, just some super obvious color that's easy to see. And then we will also do flex 1. And what I'll now do is take this set node ref off this div, and I'm going to instead put it on this div right here. And basically what I'm doing is I'm completely separating how we define the sortable context and the empty drop zone space. Now what I'm saying, if I go ahead and save it, this yellow space that you see here is what I mean when I say the empty space of the drop zone. The space that is not yellow, so it has the gray background with these draggables, is the sortable context. So now it's super obvious whether we're actually inside the sortable or we're outside in the drop zone in this yellow area. Now that we have this, and it's super obvious what I mean when I say the empty space in a drop zone, let's go ahead and scroll back up to our handle DragOver and handle this case where we actually drop it in the yellow area. What I'm going to do is I'm going to break our set Draggables into essentially two different sections. This entire section right here, all of this logic, is to simply take an item from one sortable context and move it to the sortable context of another, like this. That's all this code right here is doing. So above this, I'm going to write a comment. I'm just going to say, if we are hovering the space inside a sortable context. And then right above it, I'll make another comment. I'll say, if we're hovering the empty space in a drop zone. And then right here below this comment, we'll write the logic for this case. This keeps it split up and organized, so we know that we essentially have two separate conditions that can occur. Right underneath this top comment, let's make a condition that checks for this case. The only drop zone we have right now just has the ID of drop zone. So for right now, to make things easy, let's say if over ID equals drop zone. This is a super easy way to tell if we're actually hovering over the drop zone or not. And then if this is the case, well, we want to do something. If we've hit this condition, that means we are hovering over the yellow space and we're not inside the sortable. So the first thing I'll do in this case is make a new variable. I'm going to say const new draggable, just like this. Make an object. We're going to spread in the existing active draggable, and I'm going to throw a DZ of drop zone on it, just like this. We know that active draggable is the item in question, so we're just going to spread that in and make sure the drop zone ID gets updated to drop zone. However, we can't just do this. Set Draggables expects us to return the whole Draggables array with our updated value. So let's take a second to think about how we should do this. Well, we have two scenarios that could lead us to this condition right here. Scenario 1 is we take a draggable that's inside of a sorting context and we move it to the empty space in its exact same drop zone. Scenario 2 is we take a draggable from one sorting context like outside and moving it to the empty drop zone of another context like here. So again, option 1, we take an item from the same row, move it to the very end in the empty space and then drop it. Option 2, we take an item from a different row and drop it in another drop zone's empty space. Those are our two conditions. So we need to make sure whatever we do in this chunk right down here covers both scenarios. All we really have to do is append this new draggable to the end of the array. How we can do that is by saying return, take an array, we'll spread in the previous array, and we're just going to append new draggable just like this. This will spread in the existing draggables and simply add the new draggable to the very end of the array. If we're hovering the empty space in a drop zone, like going over here, we assume that this is the behavior that we want, just adding it to the very end of the array. However, we can't just do this. This previous right here is going to contain the existing draggable. If we just return this here, the existing draggable will stay exactly where it is and add a new one at the end. What I'm saying is we need to remove the existing one before we can add the new one to the end. And that's actually pretty easy. Instead of just returning the previous like this, we can actually filter. We can say we're returning the spreaded previous that doesn't include the active draggable. So we'll say filter and we'll say draggable where draggable.id is not equal to active draggable ID. So we're making sure we remove the item in question first, and then, and only then, do we then add it to the end of the array. One last thing, this will give us a type error right here, and that's because active draggable could be undefined. If we go ahead and scroll down, you'll see that's the error that we get right here. All we have to do with that is add a simple guard clause at the top. We already have this early return up here, returning if there's no over object on the event. We can also add another condition. We'll say, or if for whatever reason, active draggable is not defined. Active draggable theoretically should never ever be undefined because it'll always get set on the handle drag start. And we know that handle drag over can only fire if the drag start has fired. But TypeScript isn't smart enough to know this, and adding this explicit check here will just make sure we get rid of that type error. Let's go ahead and test this now. If I save it, refresh just for good measure, I take the skeleton right here, move it to the very end of the yellow zone, drop it, and it goes in automatically. Take it with prints here. Yellow zone drops in automatically. Every time, we're just making sure it appends to the very end of the array. And again, that just comes from this logic right here. We're spreading in whatever the previous items were, minus the current one, or making sure the current one gets added at the very end. So no matter if it's these draggables or I refresh it and I take this one, go to the end over here, it'll always just append itself to the end of the drop zone. However, we can also test that not only does this work adding it to the end of the drop zone, I can also go here and still sort an item inside of one. So I can go here, move it around inside, take one, move it to the end, drop it in there, and now both things work. We have just split set draggables into dual functionality. We've handled the case where we're in the empty space of a drop zone right here with this chunk and then returning. Otherwise, if we don't get that, that means we're just shifting, so we can do this chunk down here. So now we can go from outside to inside, inside to outside, and outside or inside to the empty space of the drop zone. All of these cases and bases are covered. Let's go ahead and test something real quick. Let's scroll back up to where we're defining our draggables. Let's actually take this drop zone off all of them. So we're going to start all of these undefined. So they all start in the free zone like any other tier list would. We'll take this, replace all these with undefined, go ahead and save it, refresh, and now they all start undefined. This whole drop zone is yellow because the entire yellow space is the empty drop zone space. So I can go here, drop it in, it works fine. I can drop a couple in like this, and then I say, all right, I want to rearrange these. This should go here, this should go here. Actually, no, this one should be at the front, so let's go here. And now all these cases work. We could take every single one from the inside, move it back outside, and everything still works perfectly. Now that we've done this, it's time to take care of the hardest part of this video. So far, we've dealt with basically just a single drop zone. I mean, we have these free Draggables down here, but this box that you're seeing, this yellow box with the Draggables inside of it, is the only drop zone that we're actually using. A real tier list is going to have multiple drop zones. So essentially, instead of only having one of these rows that has the Draggables and this yellow on it, we'll have like 5 or 6 that are stacked on top of each other. So we essentially need to take everything we've done and learned so far and make it work with multiple rows instead of just a single row. And the multiple rows need to be able to interact with each other super seamlessly. So I've got good news and bad news. The good news is all of the core principles and ideas that we've been building on will still apply, and for the most part, our components like Draggable and Drop Zone are going to remain unchanged. The bad news is we'll have to refactor this handle DragOver function quite a bit, because we need it to accommodate multiple rows or multiple drop zones. In addition to doing that, we'll also have to change how we're storing our draggable state. It's easy right now that we have this single array called Draggables that can just keep track of everything, because we only really have one true drop zone. However, when we start talking about doing multiple rows, one array is just not going to cut it. What I'm implying here is that we'll need an array for every single drop zone. So if I have 5 of these drop zone rows right here, so 5 layers of my tier list, I'm going to want 5 separate arrays, one for each row. This keeps it organized and structured. If I try and keep it at a single array like this, where each one just has a DZ property, I think it's going to start getting extremely messy. So with that being said, let's introduce another piece of state. Just like we have an array for our Draggables, let's also make an array for our drop zones. So right under this, I'll make a new variable. I'm going to call it default drop zones, and it's going to be an array. Just like we have a type up here for our Draggables, I'm going to make a new type for a drop zone. We'll say a drop zone, and what will a drop zone have on it? My thought is we at least need an ID, which will just be a string, and we're also going to have another property on it called Draggables, and this one is just going to be a string array. This Draggables right here for each drop zone is going to be an array of the Draggables that are inside it, or rather an array of Draggable IDs that are inside of it, not the whole Draggables themselves. Now that we have this drop zone type, looking back at default drop zones here, let's make sure it adheres to the type of drop zone array, just like this. And now let's make some drop zones. To make it simple, we'll just start with 2. So we'll make one. The first one should be an object, and it should adhere to this drop zone type here. So we'll have an ID and Draggables. So we'll say the ID for this one is just going to be drop zone still. And then the Draggables, let's say this one is just starting out as an empty array. And then drop zone number 2 is going to be ID. It's just going to say free. And for this one, we're going to map out all of our existing Draggables. So we'll say default Draggables like this, .map, and we're going to map each Draggable to an ID. The reason I'm doing this is because if we have 2 drop zones, both one called drop zone and one called free, we assume that all the Draggables are going to start within this free one. So we're essentially taking every single one of these and we're making sure they start in drop zone number 2, or the one that has the ID free. And now that we have this, in addition to having our actual state down here with Draggables and set Draggables, we'll do the exact same thing with drop zones. We're going to say const drop zones, set drop zones, equals use state. It's going to adhere, of course, to drop zone array. And we're just going to pass in default drop zones just like this. And now we need to have a fundamental shift in the way that we're thinking about our state here. Our drop zones, as we can see here, are each going to have an array of Draggable IDs attached to them, which means now our drop zones are going to be the source of truth for which Draggables are located where. Because the drop zone state is going to keep track of where everything is, we no longer need this DZ property on each of our Draggables. So what I want to do is take all of these and just completely get rid of these fields. We won't be needing that DZ anymore. Now, Draggables is no longer the source of truth, and it's held in drop zones instead. And again, this is entirely to accommodate a system where we can have multiple drop zones and not just hard-code it to one. This right here is going to change things pretty heavily. To ensure that our drop zones have the right information now, let's go ahead and scroll down to that component. So scroll down to drop zone right here. Whenever we first made this, to make it easy, we assumed that each drop zone component just needed to take in the array of all the Draggables so it can do some filtering or do some logic there to show it. However, with this new drop zones array that we're going to be working with, we can assume that each drop zone will actually take in a real drop zone object. So let's say instead of expecting a Draggables array, we're going to expect a single drop zone. So we're going to say drop zone, and drop zone is going to be of the type drop zone that we made at the top of the file. And with this, now at the top of the drop zone, we can destructure both the ID and the Draggables from the drop zone. And instead of hard coding this ID to drop zone, now we can just pass the ID through directly. And now, instead of in our items saying that we're doing this Draggables.map, all we have to do is instead just pass in Draggables like this. The Draggables that is attached to each drop zone is just a string array because it's an array of draggable IDs. It's super convenient, meaning we can plug it in directly with items, just like this. And now, instead of doing this weird filter, we can get rid of that. We can map over the Draggables directly, and for each one, we can render out a Draggable. And we can call each item in the map just Draggable ID. However, now we have a bit of a problem. This Draggables array that we're mapping over, like I just showed you, is an array of draggable IDs. However, this draggable component needs the actual full draggable itself, the whole object, not just the ID. All that this means is that we need to find the correct draggable from our Draggables array. So instead of just directly returning a draggable here, let's actually wrap this whole thing in curly braces. We're going to go ahead and make room for a function here, and it will just return this. And now we need to find which draggable we're actually talking about to pass it down to our draggable component. To get the correct draggable, we can do something like this. We can say const draggable, just like this, equals default draggables dot find, and we're going to find the draggable where the draggable ID is equal to draggable ID, just like this, which again is what we're getting out of our map. Assuming this all works correctly, this draggable variable now will be the actual draggable object that we need to pass down to our draggable component. If for whatever reason that we can't find the draggable, that means something went wrong. So right here, just to alleviate any type errors, we will say if, for whatever reason, not draggable, so we didn't find the right one, just go ahead and return null. And now, with this logic, we're safely passing down the actual draggable to our draggable component. And just for semantics here, let's make this draggable ID, just so we can make React happy. And you may be wondering, why are we searching default draggables instead of the actual draggable state? Well, the reason for that is now that we're changing the way we're doing logic and we're having drop zones as our source of truth, the draggables array should never actually change really. If we scroll up here, you can see that default draggables is literally just an ID and a source. And once the page mounts, this is never actually going to change, nor should it. So referencing default draggables would be the same as passing the draggable state down and using that instead. This just keeps it simple and avoids prop drilling. We may come back and consolidate this later. Alright, so we've just made a bunch of changes to how we're handling drop zones. Before we refactor our handle DragOver to update our drop zone state, we need to make sure our drop zones are getting the proper state passed down to them. So right now, if we scroll up here and we look at our free items, we know that all of our free items are just in the sortable context right here, purely because it was easier to set it up that way and think about it that way whenever we were first starting. However, we need to think of the free draggables as being in their own drop zone as well. So let's actually delete this entire chunk here. I'm just going to nuke it entirely. And I'm going to render a separate drop zone, and this one will be the drop zone for the free draggables. And actually, instead of doing this, I have an easier way. Let's actually just map over our drop zones. Let's go here. Our drop zone state is again in this array just called drop zones. And what we're going to say is we're going to say dropzones.map. And then for each drop zone, all we're going to do is render out the actual drop zone component. We know our drop zone is already expecting a drop zone object. So to make our lives easier, all we have to do is just pass in the drop zone directly. And if we go ahead and save it now we have two drop zones. The one at the bottom right here is our free drop zone, and that's where all the draggables are going to start. The one on top is our main drop zone, which we could also drag them into. Alright, so now we have two drop zones, not just one. So let's pause for a second. What we've just done in the past few minutes has been a total state refactor in this whole project. We basically made a whole new state up here called drop zones that just looks something like this, where each drop zone has an array of draggable IDs stored in this draggable property right here. And that is the source of truth for everything that we're going to be seeing on our page. This drop zones array is the most important thing because it literally tells us where everything is in our app. What used to be the source of truth, this Draggables array, is no longer doing much besides telling us what the ID and image source of each draggable is. So with that being said, that means we have one very big thing left to do. Our handle DragOver function right here, this whole chunk right here, contains the core logic for all of our dragging, both inside a drop zone and between two different drop zones. Right now, we're calling set draggables. But like I just said, draggables are no longer our source of truth, the drop zones are. So instead of calling set draggables, we need to instead be calling set drop zones. It means we're going to have to refactor this quite a bit. When we approach something like this, where we have a function that's already doing a lot and needs to be refactored, we should break it up into parts. And lucky for us, we already commented two distinct sections in this function. We have section 1 up here if we're hovering the empty space in a drop zone, and section 2 down here if we're hovering the space inside of the sorting context. With our new drop zone logic, to keep it as simple and headache-free as possible, we should split it up into 3 distinct cases. No more, no less. So case 1, we already have up here. So I'll go ahead and denote this. I'll say case number 1 is this. If we're hovering the empty space in a drop zone. We'll implement it here in a bit, but this case is already well defined. This right here is going to be case number 2. However, instead of saying this case is when we're in the sortable context, let's make this extremely clear and say that this case is only when we are rearranging items in the same row. Case number 3, which I'm going to comment here at the very bottom, to be another distinct case, which is now new with the introduction of multiple drop zones. This will just say case 3 is going to be if we are rearranging between 2 different rows. So now we're splitting this into 3 defined cases. Case 1, we're hovering the empty space. What that means is if I take a draggable like this and I hover it in the empty space here, so anywhere in the yellow area, that's going to be case 1. Case 2 is if we're rearranging items that are already in the same row. So if I take Mega Knight here and I want to swap it with Barbarian and I do this, this is case 2. Case number 3, the new case, is going to be if we already had a draggable up here and I wanted to move it back down into this row. So we're moving items between containers. That's going to be case 3. If we clearly define our 3 cases like this, it makes it way easier to think about. With that being said, let's tackle these one case at a time, starting with the easiest possible case, case 2. Case 2, denoted by this whole chunk right here, is when we're rearranging items in the same row. It's the easiest because we do not have to worry about moving between different zones and between different containers, which gets more complicated. In the code we already have here, we're using this array move function from Dnd-kit, and we can actually still use it. We'll only have to modify this case just a little bit. In case 2, because we're now calling set drop zones instead of set draggables, this is going to change how we're getting the old index and the new index right here. These are going to be a bit different. Right now we're just looking at previous, which before was the Draggables array, and that's how we were getting it. However, now previous is no longer the Draggables array, it is the drop zones array, so we cannot use this anymore. If we're rearranging items in the same row, we need to figure out exactly which drop zone we're in, and then use that Draggables array. So instead of calling previous.findIndex like this, what I instead want to do is I actually want to call current drop zone.Draggables.findIndex like this. This current drop zone is not yet a defined variable, but this is what we're going to use. So we'll do that for the old index. We'll do the exact same for the new index. So it's also calling current drop zone.Draggables. And then on the array move, instead of calling it with previous, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to call it with current drop zone.Draggables. So now the question is, what is this current drop zone right here? How do we know which drop zone we're in while we're moving an item around within a row? So what I'm asking is, right here on the right-hand side, we have 2 drop zones. The bottom one, the free one, is the one I'm looking at. Let's say I take this Barbarian item and I move it way over here. Cool, that seems intuitive enough. However, how do I know that we're actually in this drop zone right here? What from the DragOver event tells us that we're in this drop zone? Well, let's think about it. If I take this draggable, for example, and I want to shift it over one like this, when I move this draggable, like I said earlier, I am not over a drop zone, I am actually over the other draggable in the row. So if I take Skeleton here and I hover it over Dark Prince and they swap, I'm actually hovering over Dark Prince, I'm not hovering over the drop zone itself. We saw the same thing before, and I just want to reiterate this, that this e.over.id right here is going to be the ID of a draggable, not a drop zone. At least when we're talking about case 2, just shifting items around. So why am I pointing this out? Well, right now the drop zone that I'm moving these items around in is the free drop zone, or this bottom drop zone right here. How can I actually get that information? In the DragOver event specifically, what tells me that? The only context I have is the active ID and the over ID, and that's denoted by active draggable ID and over ID. Well, if I'm rearranging items that are in the same row, the drop zone of the active ID and the over ID should be the same, because they should share the same parent. So up here at the very top of our set drop zones, I'm going to make a new variable to tell us which drop zone we're actually in. So I'll say const current drop zone equals, and what do we search here? Well, it should just be dropzones.find, and we're going to find the drop zone where the drop zone that has a draggables array that contains the active draggable in question, we assume is the current drop zone. Now this is going to look a little bit ugly because it's really long, and it's basically doing a double loop. but this is the way we know which drop zone our draggable is currently in. We have to find the drop zone that has a Draggables array that contains the active draggable ID. That's what the current drop zone is, logically. And because, like always, since find can return undefined, let's just, for safe measure, say if, for whatever reason, we can't find the drop zone that we're over, then just go ahead and return. And for convenience right under this, let's just make a new variable, say const current drop zone ID. And that's, of course, just going to be current drop zone.id. And now that we know which drop zone we're actually in, we have everything that we need. Let's go down here. Let's look where our shifted items are. I'm actually going to delete all this logic right here, and I'm just going to rename shifted items to new Draggables. And right here, before we actually return any state, let's fix something. This should actually not be the ID, because already this current dropzone.draggables is an array of IDs. So we can just get the draggable directly like this. Say draggable here. We'll also say draggable here. And now that means that these two variables are not being used. So now that we have the old index using the current dropzone.draggables and the new index, and we have what the new draggables actually should be because we're doing the shift right here, let's now return state. So we will go ahead and say return. And the question is now, how do we update this state properly? Well, keep in mind that drop zones is an array of objects. If I'm only rearranging items that are in the same row, the only object that I actually want to update is the current drop zone. The other ones, I just want to completely ignore. So for our return here, all we're going to do is say previous.map, and then for each drop zone, we're going to do something. First things first, we're going to say if the drop zone ID is not equal to the current drop zone ID, then simply just return the existing drop zone. This logic right here is for drop zones that we're not even touching, so we don't have to worry about changing anything. So for every drop zone that isn't the one in question, just return what we already have. What this means here is if I go over on the right hand side, I take this barbarian and I start shifting items around in this one, I don't want to update this yellow drop zone up here. That has nothing to do with the shifting that's going on. So this case here is just checking that. We're saying if the drop zone ID is not the current one in question, just return it. It needs to remain unchanged. However, if we get past this if statement, that means it's the drop zone that we're rearranging. What do we want to do in this case? Well, in this case, let's return something else. Let's return, we're going to spread in whatever the existing drop zone is, and we're just going to say Draggables is new Draggables, just like this. And this right here keeps it super simple. We only have two cases. Either we're in a drop zone that's unaffected by the shifting, so we just return the old drop zone, or it is the one that's affected, in which case we make sure it's the exact same drop zone, but we give it Draggables is new Draggables, which are the updated and shifted items. And now case 2 is all set up and good to go, with one more thing needed. Right now, this case right here is not wrapped in an if block, so it's always going to execute no matter what. If we want to handle this intelligently, we should have if statements for each case. That way we only run the case if the condition actually matches. Right here, let's go and say if, and then have some block here. And let's move all of this logic into our if statement. Go ahead and tab this for better styling. And now we got to ask ourselves, what actually is the condition that would trigger case 2? How do we know for sure that we're rearranging items in the same row? Well, one easy way to tell is if the active ID and the over ID are in the same drop zone. That means we're just rearranging. The way that we can do that is by just saying in here, we can say current drop zone dot draggables dot sum, and we assume that sum draggable is going to be equal to the over draggable. Remember that this current drop zone variable right here is purely based on whatever the active draggable is. So we're basically saying in this case 2 condition right here, this whole clause right here, we're saying, okay, does the Draggables array in the current drop zone also contain the over ID? If that's the case, that means that both the active and the over are in the same drop zone, meaning case 2 should fire. This will keep all of our logic safe and ensure that we're only executing this when we're for sure just rearranging 2 items that are already in the same row. And because we wrapped all this in its own thing, we no longer have a guaranteed return for our function. So down here at the very bottom, just to be safe, let's just say return previous, if for some reason all of our cases fall through. All right, let's now go ahead and test. I'm going to go ahead and comment out this whole case 1 right here. I don't want this to accidentally fire and end up messing things up. So we'll go ahead and save this, go ahead and refresh over here. And now we have our Draggables. I can take one here, move it like this, drop it, and it places. So I can go here, shift it over, and it places no matter what. No matter which draggable I take, it's always going to work with rearranging items that are in the same row, We still have smooth animations, and we have smooth and clean logic now, using our updated drop zones architecture. So now that we've got the ability to rearrange items that are in the same row, let's now fix the logic to drop an item in the empty space of a drop zone. So we're going to revisit case 1 up here. Again, I want to reiterate that case 1 is whenever we're hovering the empty space in a drop zone. Whenever we take an item and we hover over a drop zone's yellow space here. Alright, so with case 1, let's look at the logic we already have. Let's go ahead and uncomment this. To get the condition for case 1, before we were just checking if the over ID is equal to drop zone. That was when we only had the one drop zone, so the only valid ID was actually just drop zone. We only have to modify this condition very slightly. We need to check if the ID that we're hovering over is a drop zone. That's the only possible way this case could fire, if the over ID is a drop zone ID. So up here, right below our default drop zones, I'm going to make a quick helper array. I'm going to say const drop zone IDs equals, and it's going to be default drop zones.map, and we're going to map each drop zone to its own ID. So now this is just an array of drop zone IDs. Right now, because we only have 2 drop zones, it would just be an array of length 2 with drop zone and free both as strings. So now for case 1, what we can do is we can go into here, and instead of saying if over ID is equal to drop zone, we can just check if over ID is one of the drop zone IDs. So we can say if drop zone IDs dot includes over ID, just like this. If we make it into this if block here, that means for a fact that we are hovering over a drop zone. So the condition for case 1 will be met. And now, once we're inside this right here, we know that we're inside of a drop zone. Let's find out which one. So let's go ahead and just get rid of all this logic. Let's say const drop zone equals previous.find, and we're going to find the drop zone where the drop zone ID matches the over ID. If we go ahead and right here hover drop zone, it's going to say that it can be of drop zone or undefined, because find could always come back not finding anything, in which case it would return undefined. However, we have just verified that if we get into this if block, that means that our over ID is one of the drop zone IDs. So logically, it actually cannot be undefined. TypeScript is just not smart enough to assert that. So what we can do is we can just assert that it can't be undefined by adding an exclamation mark at the end of this find. Now, if we hover it, it says it is just of type drop zone. Normally, I don't like using this non-null assertion operator, but in this case, logically, drop zone cannot be undefined because we've made it into this if block. Now that we know which drop zone we're adding this draggable to, all we have to do is reconstruct our draggables just like we were doing before. So let's right here say const new draggables, just like this, equals an array, and we're going to spread in our existing drop zone draggables, and we're simply just going to add the new active draggable ID. And this is basically doing the exact same thing we're doing before. We're spreading in the old array, and we're just appending the new item to the very end, which is always the case for this case 1 when we're hovering the empty space in a drop zone. However, before, we were also filtering the items here to make sure it didn't get duplicated. So let's go ahead and add that back. We'll just say on the dropzone.draggables, we're going to add a filter, and we're going to filter out the draggables that are not equal to the active draggable ID. And when I say filter out, I mean that we're actually only going to take the ones that are not the active draggable ID. The one that is active will get filtered out and then just appended to the end like before. What this condition prevents is if I take a draggable and move it to the yellow space at the very end of its row, that we don't both keep the draggable where it was and add a new one. It will make sure we never have duplicates. If I don't end up filtering it out and doing this, I'll just end up with 2 on the exact same row. And now that we have our new draggables, let's mimic how we did case 2. In case 2, we had new draggables, and then we just did previous.map, and we figured out what we wanted to return for each one. Let's do the exact same thing. So for case 1 up here, we will say up here, we're just going to return, and we're going to return previous.map, and we'll do the exact same thing. For each drop zone, we're going to do something. Just like with case 2, whenever we're doing previous.map, that means we're mapping over every single existing drop zone. Drop zones that were unaffected by this move should not change at all. So similar to how we're doing case 2, let's have an if clause at the top that prevents unnecessary changes. So we'll say if the drop zone ID is not equal to the over ID and the drop zone ID is not equal to the current drop zone ID, then we're just going to return to that drop zone. This means that if the drop zone is not the new one and it's not the old one, that means it has nothing to do with this, so let's just return the existing drop zone. Otherwise, what we can do is we can just say return, and we will just spread in this existing drop zone, and we're going to say draggables is just new draggables. Easy. Just like that, we've got case 1 figured out. Now if I go ahead and save it, and I refresh just to be safe, and I take one of these items, like the skeleton in the free drop zone, I can hover the main drop zone up here, and it will move right in. However, we've completely missed one condition, which just cooked this whole list. Notice how we added the Draggables to the top drop zone, so I'll refresh here. We added the Draggable to the top drop zone, but we did not remove it from the old one. So now if I try and pick this one up, they're both going to pick up or get this weird kind of limbo state, because now we have two Draggables that have the exact same ID that are sitting in different drop zones. And we have that, plus the fact that both these drop zones are now just completely empty, which for obvious reasons is not what we want. So what I'm saying is, in case 1 in our return, we need to make sure that in addition to adding the Draggable to its new drop zone, we remove it from its old zone. And we have an explicit check for that, so we don't just brick both drop zones. This filter that we're doing right here is only going to work when we're dealing with a drop zone in the same row as the sorted items. If we ever go between zones, so taking an item, for example, from this free drop zone to the yellow up top into a different drop zone, this filter right here is not going to catch that. It's only going to catch items that are in that same array. And this is not actually a huge problem, we just need an additional check. So above this first if check, let's just be very explicit right here. Let's make a comment and we'll just say if not the old or new, just return. And above the main return here, let's just say add to new one. Above this, we'll make another comment that just says remove from the old one if we went across zones. And the condition for if we need to remove the old one is just going to be if this particular drop zone ID is equal to the current one and the current drop zone ID is not equal to over ID. We're just checking to make sure this drop zone is the actual drop zone in question and it's not equal to the one that we're hovering over, meaning the new drop zone. If both of these cases hit, that would indicate the drop zone in question, or this DZ right here, is the old one that we moved from. So if I again refresh this, I take skeleton, move it into the top row, the one that we came from is obviously this bottom row. So now that means it's this DZ right here. So in this one, what we'll do is we'll just say return, and we're going to spread in the existing drop zone, and we're going to say Draggables is just dz.draggables.filter, and then we're just going to filter it out the same way we're doing up top here. So we'll take this exact same condition here, everything in the parentheses here, take that in, and now we're filtering it in the exact same way that we're filtering up here. This particular check right here just checks to make sure that we're still filtering it out when we're switching across zones. And it will help prevent the idea of having duplicates like we have on our page right now, and it won't just completely blank out both rows. So now, if I go ahead and save this, and I go ahead and refresh this, I take the skeleton here, move it up here, and boom, they update. Take Dark Prince, move here, Elixir Golem, move all of these, and now they're updating perfectly, just the way that we'd expect them to. So what does this mean now? Well, now, if I go ahead and again start fresh on this page, now I have support for two major things. I can take items, rearrange them in their own row, just like this, perfectly smoothly, and I can take them and add them to an empty row, or just anywhere in the yellow space of a drop zone. So I can take these, move them up here, and it works perfectly fine. If I want to move them back down from the top one to the bottom one, I can still do that. Our logic handles both cases, so I can go here to here, here to here, here to here, and you get the idea. What that means is we literally only have one more case to get finished before we finished all of our complex logic in this video. And that is case 3. That's the case where, let's say we have items in both rows, something like this. Case 3 is when I take an item, let's say this bomber right here, and I try to move him between an item in this top row. Notice right now nothing's going to happen because there's no logic for that, but we need to have support for that. If I want to take this Mega Knight and move him between these two, I need to be able to do that and have it animate smoothly and work perfectly. And this right here is arguably the most complex case because we're going to have to manually shift over the items and make sure we do everything intelligently. Let's get it. In our handle DragOver, we've made room for where we're going to put case 3. It's just this right here. We're going to put all of this inside an else if clause, and actually for consistency, we'll also do that for case 2 as well, because the first if is case 1 up here. So we'll have case 1 being an if, case 2 being an else if, and then also case 3 being an else if. What makes the condition for case 3 easy is that case 3 is the logical opposite of case 2. Case 2 is if our active and over items are in the exact same row. Case 3 is going to be when our active and over items are in different rows. What makes this condition super easy is we can take the condition for case 2 which is literally just this right here. We can copy it, we can paste it in here, and because they're logical opposites, all we have to do is negate this. And now if we negate it, what this condition right here is essentially saying is if the active draggable and the draggable that we're over do not share the same drop zone parent. That's all this condition is saying, which means we are rearranging between two different rows. If we look up, we know we have this current drop zone variable right here. And this current drop zone always means the drop zone that we are coming from. However, for case 3, we're going to need to know the drop zone that we are dropping into because the two are going to be different. So let's find that. We can actually take this condition for current drop zone, go ahead and copy it. We'll actually go into case 3 here, into the if. Let's go ahead and paste it in. And all we're going to do is just rename this to new drop zone instead of current drop zone. And instead of checking for the active draggable ID, all we have to do is check for the over ID. Current drop zone again tells us which drop zone we're coming from. New drop zone, this variable we just made, tells us which drop zone that we're actually dropping into. And to avoid potential TypeScript mishaps, let's just do an early return. We'll say if, for whatever reason, there is no new drop zone, let's just return previous. Let's go ahead and save it to get some formatting. And now the question is, what do we do? Well, in case 2, we have this helper function called arrayMove that allowed us to shift items out of the way in a super easy manner. However, arrayMove only works when the items in question are already in the same array. With case 3, we will actually be inserting an item into the new drop zone and removing it from the old one. So just to clarify, whenever I have a case like this, where I have a few draggables in each row, and I take, let's say, the minor, for instance, and I move it up, I'm going to insert it into this new drop zone, but it's going to get removed from its old drop zone. So we cannot use this arrayMove method. They're not in the same array, so it's not that simple. We have to handle it ourselves. But the good news is we can do something really clutch here to make it actually pretty simple. So right here, down below our return, if you're familiar with the splice function in JavaScript, you know this is how we can insert an item into an array. So what I'll do is I will say const new draggables equals new drop zone dot draggables, just like this, dot to spliced, and the API for it is something like this. It's going to be index 0, and then whatever item we have. All that each of these are is the index that we want to insert an item at, 0 to make sure that when we insert, we don't delete any items, and then item is the actual item that's being inserted into the array. And we already know what will be inserted is the active draggable ID. So let's go ahead and replace item with active draggable ID, just like this. The real question is, how do we know what index we're actually inserting at? Well, the index to insert at would just be the index of whichever item that we're hovering, right? In that case, we can make this pretty simple. We can say const over index equals, and it's going to be new drop zone dot draggables dot find index, and we're going to find the draggable that matches, if I can spell, that matches the over ID. This will give us the index of the item that we are hovering over. And now we can simply pass this to our toSpliced. Just like with case 2, whenever we're rearranging items like this, the item that we are over is the item that we are moving our current draggable to. So if I have, again, let's start fresh here. If I have Barbarian right here, I want to move him to where the skeleton is. I have to hover over skeleton to get there. So getting this over index here is just saying, okay, which draggable are we actually over? Let's just capture that index. And then we pass it to the toSpliced. So now with this, we're saying, take the new drop zone and insert whatever our new item is, or whatever the active draggable is. So if I have a few items like this here, the active draggable right now is Barbarian. If I go up here, I want to insert it right where the Dark Prince is. So then it would insert between skeleton and Dark Prince. One thing to note real quick, we'll actually get an error using this toSpliced here because it's going to say it doesn't exist on type array. toSpliced is actually a pretty new method in JavaScript. It used to just be splice. So what we can actually do is we can go into our file explorer here. If we look at, I believe it is the tsconfig.app.json. Yeah, so this 2022 here should actually be 2023. If we change this here and go back to our app, it should get rid of that error because now we recognize that we're using the newest version of JavaScript, so we do have access to it. The only difference between splice and toSpliced is that splice will actually modify an array in place. toSpliced will not modify it. With React State, you never want to modify an array in place. So we're using toSpliced, that way we don't accidentally modify the drop zones when we're not yet trying to. This just makes a copy of it, which we are storing in new Draggables. And now the logic for inserting our item into this new drop zone is all taken care of. So below this, like all the other cases, we're going to go ahead and say return previous.map. And then for each drop zone, we're going to do something. Same drill as before. If it's not the new or the old drop zone, just ignore it. So we're going to say if the dropzone.id is not equal to current dropzone ID and dropzone ID is not equal to new dropzone.id, so it's neither the old one nor the new one, let's return dropzone. Because in this case, we don't care. We just want to return what was there before. Above it, just to be clear what I'm saying here, we'll say if not the new or old dropzone, just return it as is. And then below this, we'll make our other cases. The next case is that we need to remove the item from its original drop zone. So if I have items like this, I take the baby dragon here, I want to move it up top. We've already got the logic to add it to the new one, but now I need to make sure I remove it from the old one. So let's handle that. We can actually take pretty much the exact same condition from case 1 here, which is just this, I believe. Go ahead and paste it in here, and we're just going to, for this comment, just say remove from the old one. And the condition will have to change a little bit. It'll just be if dropzone ID is equal to the current dropzone ID. And we'll just make sure this is an else if. If we have made it past both these two cases right here, so both this first if statement and this else if right here, that means the only possible option left is adding it to the new one. So just like we've done with all the other cases, for when we're adding a new item in, we'll just say return. We will spread in the existing drop zone, and we're going to say Draggables is equal to new Draggables, which is our shifted array that we use to spliced on. And above this, we'll just make sure be consistent here, and we'll say add to new. So now whenever we return, we're saying if the drop zone is unaffected, just return it as is. If it was where the old one came from, filter the old one out, just get rid of it. If it's where the new one should be dropped, go ahead and return it with the new dropped items. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have just cooked up an absolutely fire handle drag over function. This should literally handle every case that could ever happen when we drag over something. Let's actually see this in action. If I go ahead and save it now, go ahead and refresh to get our Draggables. We start with a full row at the bottom. I'm going to move a few of these into the row above it. So I'll move, let's say, these items. Now, moment of truth. I want the miner to go in between the skeleton and the elixir golem. So I can just do this, just like that. And now it magically inserts. All cases covered. Just to show you that it's not a fluke, I can take this here, move it here. Boom, boom, boom. I'm inserting items in between others and they're dropping perfectly. I can, of course, do the inverse. I can take items from the top row and move them into the bottom. And one thing you'll notice that's super nice is because we're handling the state so cleanly, is that if I take an item from, let's say, the top row and move it to the bottom row, notice how the items all animate smoothly. They animate smoothly to close the gap in the top row. So right now, flanking the skeleton, we have Baby Dragon and we have Prince here. Once I move the skeleton down, the Prince is going to shift over to cover the hole. And we're going to shift over to make room for the skeleton in this row. So they both animate super smoothly and super nicely. That is the benefit to handling all of our state in the handle drag over function as opposed to handling it in the handle drag end function. Let's now do a quick demo that properly showcases all three of our cases, meaning literally any combination of moves between these two drop zones. If I go ahead and refresh to start fresh here, we have all of our items in this bottom drop zone right here. This is all full. I say, all right, I want to rearrange these items. So I want to move this guy maybe here, move this guy here, and then this guy should go at the very beginning. Okay, cool. They're rearranged. Now I want to go to this row up here. Let's take this guy up a row, move him here. Let's take these few. Let's put them in this order. And I'm like, you know what? Wait a minute. I actually don't want to do that. This guy needs to be back down here, obviously. Nerf miner. So we bring him down here. We can rearrange in the same row. We can take him to the very end if we want. This just knows that it drops in because it's smart. And we can literally take any combination of things here and it just works. I can go here, move all these to the very top row. And now they're all in the very top. I can move these over just like this. I say, all right, golem should go back down here. Miner should go back down here. And every time I move something, everything is going to shift and animate smoothly because we're handling state in a very clean and efficient manner. All right, so now I can probably guess the question that you're thinking to yourself. Wait a minute, didn't we have almost all this logic working entirely like an hour ago when we had the first drop zone and then we had the free Draggables below it? And the answer is sort of yes. But now we have the perfect architecture to support having as many possible drop zones as we want, with complete fluid logic between all of them where we handle every single case. Now that we have this logic, building out these actual tier list rows are going to be absolute cake. Let me show you. Let's go ahead and go up here and let's just add a few more drop zones. So right now we only have these 2 drop zones here. I'll just take this main one and I'm going to copy and paste it 4 times. 1, 2, 3, 4. So now we're going to have 5 drop zones plus the one for the free Draggables. For the IDs, let's make each of them the actual tier. So usually we have S tier, and then we have normally A tier, we have B tier, C tier, and let's just say D tier. For now, there's no F tier, but we can always add it later. And now, if I go ahead and save it, and refresh the page here, we have 6 total drop zones. We have the 5 main ones right here, and we have the 1 free one. If I want to take items between drop zones, it's super easy. I say, all right, Barbarian should go here, this goes here, boom, boom, boom. And because we architected it in a way where we handle all the cases and we handle the IDs safely, now this has become very fluid and I can move items wherever I want to. Once I've got them here, I say, all right, I want this one to go here, so I can just get them up here and it smoothly animates out of the way and it just works like clockwork. All we have to do now is add just a little bit of styling and this will be super crisp. Firstly, if we go to the outermost div in the JSX here, we can go ahead and get rid of this gap 16. I'm just going to nuke this so they're all touching each other. And then because the yellow was just to show you kind of how things worked, we don't need that color anymore. Let's go ahead and take the yellow off. If I go ahead and refresh to get all of our items back, now it works the same exact way as before, but it looks a bit cleaner. And also just to get rid of this little green thing, that was purely also to show you how that was kind of working. So get rid of that as well. So we'll go to drop zone. And let's see, where's the green color? Yeah, it's a style right here. Don't need that anymore. Don't want it to be green. So we can get rid of these things here because those are not needed. And now, without the green or any other weird yellow color, these all just work fluidly. And we don't have the weird colors kind of making these look awkward. And real quick, before we add anything else, I noticed we have a little bit of red in this file. It looks like the set drop zones is returning a possible undefined condition. And that's actually because, funny enough, I did not mean to put this inside of the set drop zones. I meant to put it actually outside here. So this should go above it. I actually didn't realize it was doing that, funny enough, because if we're doing the set drop zones, then we would just be running that double for loop, essentially, this right here, inside of the setter function, which isn't inherently a horrible thing because it's not yet inside of the map, but it's probably better to just pull it out here. Once I do this early return like this, that makes sure that undefined can't be a possible type. So now that should get rid of all the red in this file. Another thing you've surely noticed is that hot module reloading kind of gets cooked whenever we save here, because then we just basically lose all the Draggables. However, if someone were actually using this, they wouldn't be hot module reloading, so it should just start fresh like this. If that starts annoying you and you want to fix the hot module reloading, I think all you need to do is just pull this stuff actually inside of app here and then just memoize it so the IDs don't change. Because when the hot module reload happens, if these things are outside of any sort of React state and they're just kind of declared in the file, sometimes the hot module reloading can just get a little bit finicky. So it shouldn't really be a problem, but if you want to fix it, you can just pull them down into app here. It shouldn't make a difference. Let's add something real quick. Down here, whenever we're mapping over our drop zones to show all of them, we're doing, where is it? Right here, we're just mapping over our drop zones to show all 6 of them. Let's filter out the free drop zone from our mapping. So I'm going to say .filter, and in this filter, we're going to say we want to filter out the drop zone that is equal to free. So we're only going to show ones that are not free. And I believe free was the ID here. Just double check. Yeah, it should just be dz.id not equal to free. So that should be dz.id there. And so we're going to filter out the free one from here. So now if I save it, we shouldn't have any Draggables because now we're not showing the free ones. And the reason I'm doing that is because I just want to show the free Draggables in their own uniquely styled drop zone and not one that looks like the rest of them. So what I'll do is below these drop zones here, I'm just going to make another drop zone just like this. And then to actually figure out which drop zone is our free one, we can actually do something pretty simple right here. We'll just say const free drop zone, and that's just going to be dropzones.find. And we're going to find the drop zone where the ID is, of course, equal to free. And because we should always have a free drop zone, let's just do a return to make sure we alleviate any type errors. We'll say if not free drop zone, then for whatever reason, we'll just return null. And then we'll say the drop zone for this drop zone is going to be the free drop zone. So now should have all 6 of our rows back, but we're rendering out the free drop zone separately. Let's now add some finishing touches to this. Inside of our drop zone component right here, let's add another div right below the outermost one. We're just going to add a div right here that will accept children. This will essentially just be like the label or title of each row. Because our IDs are our tier rows, like we have an ID of S, an ID of A, ID of B, so forth, we will just put ID inside of this div. Just to give it some styles, we'll give it a class name. We'll say width 30, make it flex, justify center, item center. These 3 are just to center it within the div. And then we will say text 4XL and also font semi-bold. And now, if we go ahead and save it, we can see inside of each row what our actual rows are. I went ahead and just found this color map down here that I just added. That is basically just some unique RGB colors and, for whatever reason, a single hex color that'll give each of these labels or titles for each row just some background color. So let's go back up to drop zone here. Let's actually use that map. We can get the color directly out of there if we just say const background color equals drop zone color map, and then we're going to pass through the ID. We're going to get a type error here saying that because ID is just a generic string, it implicitly is going to have any type here. If we're confident that this ID can only match one-to-one with this color map, which in our case we know it can, we only have S, A, B, C, and D, then what we can do to alleviate this, we can actually just typecast this. We can say as key of type of drop zone color map. This is the easy way around that type error. And now what makes our life easier is on this little label div here, we can just do style and we can pass in background color directly now. Now, if I go ahead and save it, each one has its own background color. And just to make sure this text doesn't blend in with the background color, let's actually change this to be black. So we'll just throw text black on here. Now it looks a little bit nicer. Now we just have one more thing to fix. This free drop zone down here should probably be styled a little bit differently than the rest of the drop zones. It looks kind of out of place being attached to the rest of them. There's more sophisticated ways of doing this, and we could do it technically in the same drop zone component. But to make this easier, I'm actually going to take drop zone exactly here, basically this entire component, and we're just going to make a duplicate of it, but instead we're going to call this free drop zone and just style it a little bit differently. It won't have the extra div we just added, so we can go ahead and remove that whole chunk, which means we can also just get rid of the background color as well. And instead of having these styles right here, let's get rid of this border white and instead replace the border with whatever the background color of the regular drop zones currently is. So we'll say border is this color here. And now if we go ahead and save it and we go up here and we replace our drop zone for the free Draggables with free drop zone. Oops, went too far. Let's say free drop zone just like this. Now our items are kind of in their own little space. If we want to make it look a bit nicer, we could always add some more stuff. We could say, I don't know, border 2. And then something like rounded LG maybe, just to make it look a little bit more clean. And then we'll want to detach this slightly from the rest of the tier list. So let's go up to our main app div up here. We can just wrap all of this right here in its own div. So we'll say wrap it in a div. We'll just throw a class name. We'll say flex call, and we'll say, I don't know, maybe gap 16. That looks really cursed. So let's go ahead and make this width full. And it should go back. And actually, that's the wrong way to go about it. What I actually should do is just make this width full. This should wrap just the drop zones that are mapping over. And then we can add the gap on this div up here. We can say gap 16, just like this. And now this is more aligned with what we want. And that now, ladies and gentlemen, is a complete and working tier list maker. Now that we've come this far, let's do one last final demo. So I have all my free Draggables here. I'm like, all right, let's start moving our items into our rows. Let's add a few here. Let's just get all of them out of this free row. So we'll add this here, these 2 here, and we'll add, of course, Golem at the very top. And then I want to start moving between rows. And if I do that, everything just kind of works. All of these animate smoothly out of the way. The animations are crisp. The state updates automatically because we're handling it in the onDragOver event. And it all works in the exact way that you would expect a tier list maker to work. So whether I want to take an item from inside to moving it back outside, I want to sort them outside like this, or I want to move them up inside or add items to an empty zone, something like that. It just kind of works. And with that, we now have a fully functioning tier list maker. There's a lot that you could build out from here. You could add the ability to shift tiers around, to have draggables that are all of different sizes or aspect ratios, to have more responsive design, and you get the idea. I didn't test what this looks like on bigger screens or smaller screens, for example, and right now it's easy because I'm assuming that every single draggable is always the exact same size. So if there's things you wanted to handle like that, by all means, feel free to mess with this code and add whatever you'd like. The base functionality for handling all of the movement and every potential thing you could think of on a tier list is there. There's a lot of customization that you could add to make this flawless in all possible scenarios. As we end up, let me just quickly summarize everything that we've done from a very broad general perspective. We're using Dnd-kit, so we're using the core hooks, use droppable, and use draggable. Well, in this case, use sortable, because they're essentially draggables that need to be sorted around. However, use draggable and use sortable are pretty similar. So we have a core draggable component, and we also have a core drop zone component. Our items, the images that you're seeing, are our draggables. The rows that we can drop things into are our drop zones. We use SortableContexts directly from Dnd-kit sortable to allow us to rearrange items within rows or just move items around in general like this. Whether it's in the same row or we're taking an item from up here and moving it into the sortable context of this row. We can sort items just the way we want them to. All of the core functionality that we're really doing on this whole project comes from one main function, and that's this huge function right here, handle DragOver. Right now, it is actually pretty big. It's right around 100 lines, but that makes sense because it contains literally all of our drag and drop logic. And that's pretty much it. I hope you like this video, and if you like watching me build out real apps like this, please let me know in the comments down below. I'm trying to gauge how popular these types of videos are relative to more tutorial type videos. So your feedback is more than welcome. That being said, take care everyone, and I'll see you in the next one.